There are men who history buries quietly, not because they were small, but because what they knew was too dangerous to speak aloud. Men who stood at the center of the most catastrophic collapse of modern civilization, watched it burn from the inside, and then walked away. Not into a courtroom, not into a prisoner's dock, but into the unremarkable rhythms of ordinary life, selling trucks, keeping silence, growing old. This is one of those stories, and once you hear it, you will not forget it easily. Somewhere beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, in the spring of 1945, a man sat in a concrete bunker while the world above him caught fire. Around him, an empire that had promised 1,000 years was counting its final hours in days, then minutes. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Red Army was within walking distance of the room where the body still lay. And this man, this SS general, this Lübeck carpenter's son who had climbed from the bottom of the party rolls to the very innermost ring of power, received permission to attempt the impossible. He was to lead what remained of his command out of the encirclement and into whatever came next. His name was Wilhelm Mohnke. He was born on the 15th of March, 1911. He died on the 6th of August, 2001. And in the 90 years between those two dates, he witnessed things that most historians have spent decades trying to reconstruct. He never wrote a memoir. He gave only a handful of interviews. He lived, for the most part, in comfortable silence, a silence that infuriated survivors, frustrated prosecutors across 3 countries, and ultimately outlasted every investigator who came after him. If you have been searching for a documentary that takes you deep, not just into the battles, not just into the bunker, but into the full arc of one man's journey through the entire machinery of the Third Reich, from its earliest formation to its final collapse, then stay with us. We are going to spend the next several hours in the company of history. We are going to be precise. We are going to be honest. And we are going to let the facts speak with the full weight they deserve. Make yourself comfortable. This is the complete history of Wilhelm Mohnke, last defender of the bunker. Pause. Single piano note. Then the score builds slowly. If this kind of deep historical storytelling is what you came here for, consider subscribing now. We release long-form documentaries like this one every week. And if you want to watch the full 18-chapter series on the final days of the Berlin Bunker Command, the full playlist is linked in the description below. Under. Chapter 1. A Carpenter's Son from Lübeck. Under. The city of Lübeck sits at the edge of the Baltic coast of northern Germany, shaped by centuries of merchant trade and the slow, patient rhythms of craftsmen's hands. It is a city of brick spires and narrow waterways, of guild halls and the smell of timber and salt water, a place where a man was measured by what he made with his hands and what he passed on to his children. In the spring of 1911, into this world, Wilhelm Mohnke was born, the son of a cabinet maker who shared his son's name, who worked wood into furniture and shaped things meant to last. The father would not live long enough to see what his son became, and perhaps that is its own kind of mercy. Mohnke grew up without his father. After his father's death, the young Wilhelm went to work for a glass and porcelain manufacturer, a practical, unglamorous route that a boy of modest means took when the path ahead offered no obvious shortcuts. He worked his way up into a management position, which told you something about his temperament: patient, methodical, capable of earning authority through performance rather than inheritance. He also, at some point, acquired a degree in economics, a detail that gets lost in the military biography, but matters, because it speaks to a young man who was trying to climb somewhere, who was not content to stay where circumstance had placed him. Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s was not a place that rewarded patience easily. The economy had collapsed, then lurched upward, then collapsed again. Political violence was not exceptional, it was routine. Into this environment, A movement was growing that offered clarity in place of confusion, identity in place of drift, and a promise of national restoration that resonated with a generation of young German men who had grown up in the shadow of defeat. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, known by its initials, was not yet in power when Wilhelm Mohnke encountered it. But it was loud, it was organized, and it was moving fast. On the 1st of September, 1931, Mohnke joined the party, his membership number recorded as 649,684. He was 20 years old. The world was still open. The consequences of that signature were still entirely invisible. Just 2 months after joining the party, he joined the Schutzstaffel, the SS, with the membership number 15,541. He began at the bottom, as an ordinary SS man, a private. He was assigned to the Lübeck troop of the 4th SS Standarte. It was an unglamorous posting, a local unit, nothing that would distinguish him from the hundreds of young men who were signing their names to the same organizations across Germany in those years. But Mohnke was not the kind of man who stayed unglamorous for long. He moved, he transferred, he continued to perform, and within months, his name was being passed along channels that led somewhere considerably more significant than a regional trupp in a Baltic port city. In January of 1932, he was transferred to the 22nd SS Standarte in Schwerin. The posting placed him in proximity to officers who would become central figures in the Waffen-SS, men whose names would later appear in dispatches from Poland, France, Russia, and Normandy. It was here, or thereabouts, that Mohnke first crossed paths with the networks of ambition and loyalty that would define his entire career. It was also around this period that the political situation in Germany was moving toward its critical threshold, the moment when the party that Mohnke had joined as a 20-year-old would seize the apparatus of the state entirely. And when that moment came, in January of 1933, everything accelerated. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany on the 30th of January 1933. Within weeks, SS headquarters in Berlin sent a directive to all SS regiments: submit the names of 3 of your best soldiers for transfer to a new unit, a personal guard for the Führer. It was a directive that would change the lives of every man selected, in ways none of them could fully anticipate. Wilhelm Mohnke was among those chosen. He was personally selected by Sepp Dietrich, a name that will appear many more times in this story, and assigned to SS Stabswache Berlin, the Staff Guard Berlin, which established its first guard at the original Reich Chancellery. Mohnke was 22 years old. He was one of 117 original members of what would grow into one of the most powerful and most notorious military formations in the history of the war. The road ahead was very long, and it would exact a very high price. By August of 1933, Mohnke was one of 2 company commanders in the growing unit. In September of that year, the unit was reorganized, merged with training units from Zossen and Jüterbog under Dietrich's command, and renamed SS Sonderkommando Berlin. Then, in November, on the 10th anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch, that failed coup attempt in Munich that had once nearly ended Hitler's political career before it began, the Sonderkommando assembled and swore personal allegiance to Hitler himself, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, not to the office of Chancellor, to the man. That ceremony, that oath, would bind men like Mohnke to a chain of loyalty that proved impossible to break, even when breaking it would have been the rational choice, the humane choice, the survivable choice. At the conclusion of the ceremony, the unit received its permanent name, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the Führer's own. From that moment, Wilhelm Mohnke was not simply a soldier, he was something more specific and something more dangerous. On the 13th of April, 1934, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, issued an order renaming the unit once more. It became the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Lhasa. The addition of those two letters, SS, was not administrative housekeeping. It was a declaration that this formation answered not to the regular army, the Wehrmacht, but to the SS, and therefore to Himmler, and through him, to Hitler. The Lesser would go to war in September of 1939 as part of the German invasion of Poland, but that was still 5 years away, and in those 5 years, the unit would grow from a ceremonial guard into a formidable military force, while the country it served moved step by step toward a catastrophe of its own making. Mohnke was there for every step. He was not a bystander. He was, by every measure, a participant. The Lübeck that had shaped him, the brick spires, the merchant traditions, the smell of Baltic water and cabinet-makers' sawdust, was receding now into the distance of memory. What was replacing it was something harder and colder and far more consequential. A young man's ambition had found an outlet in an organization that rewarded loyalty above all else, that measured a man not by his craftsmanship, but by his willingness to follow orders without hesitation. Whether Mohnke understood, in those early years of the 1930s, where that willingness would ultimately lead him into the heart of Europe's most destructive war, into allegations of atrocity that would follow him for the rest of his life, into a concrete bunker beneath a burning city, is a question that history cannot answer with certainty. What is certain is that the choice was made, the oath was sworn, the unit that would carry him to the end of the world had found its name, and Wilhelm Mohnke was inside it from the very beginning. Undersir, Chapter 2, The Making of a Soldier, Poland and the Western Front. Underscore. The invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939 changed Europe in ways that no map revision, no treaty, no diplomatic formula could fully reverse. It was the moment the era of negotiated catastrophe ended, and the era of open catastrophe began. The Wehrmacht crossed the Polish border in the early morning hours of that September day with a speed and coordination that the world had not yet learned to anticipate. Armor and infantry moving together in ways that the textbooks of the previous war had not prepared defenders to resist. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler moved with them. It was one of several SS units that participated in the Polish campaign, and for the men inside it, it was the first real test of what they had been training for since the early 1930s. For Wilhelm Mohnke, commanding the 5th Company of the 2nd Battalion, it was the opening chapter of a military career that would span the entire war. He was wounded on the 7th of September 1939, barely a week into the campaign. The wound was serious enough to send him to a hospital in Prague to recover. He was awarded the Wound Badge in black, and then, as he healed, the Iron Cross Second Class on the 29th of September, followed by the Iron Cross First Class on the 8th of November. 2 decorations in the space of roughly 6 weeks, both earned in a campaign that lasted less than 2 months in total. It was a pattern that would define Mohnke's career: wound followed by recovery, followed by decoration, the machinery of military recognition turning steadily alongside the machinery of destruction. He returned to his unit. He continued to climb. The campaign in Poland was over by early October. Germany and the Soviet Union had divided the country between them under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a detail that still carries a cold irony, given what would come later between those two powers. But for the men of the Lhasa, the immediate future pointed west: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, the British expeditionary force that had deployed to the continent. The full weight of the Western Allied powers, arrayed across territory that Germany had failed to conquer, in 4 years of grinding war between 1914 and 1918. This time, the campaign would be measured not in years, but in weeks. And in those weeks, something happened near a small town in northern France that would follow Wilhelm Mohnke for the rest of his life. The German campaign in the West began on the 10th of May, 1940. Mohnke led the 5th Company at the outset, the same command he had held in Poland. On the 28th of May, the battalion commander was wounded, and Mohnke took command of the 2nd Battalion, the promotion that placed him in charge of the unit at precisely the moment when the events near Wormhout would unfold. What happened in and around that small town in northern France, in the days following the collapse of the Allied defensive line and the desperate retreat toward Dunkirk, is a matter of historical record and of bitter, unresolved legal controversy. It begins with prisoners of war. The Leibstandarte had been fighting hard around Wormhout, and the fighting had been costly. The British and French troops defending the area had resisted with enough determination to force Sepp Dietrich himself, the regimental commander, the man who had personally selected Mohnke for the original Stabswache back in 1933, to spend his birthday hiding in a ditch, using a dead cow as cover while enemy fire swept the area. Their battalion commander had been killed. By any measure, the men of the Lussasar had been through a brutal and humiliating stretch of days. And then the prisoners arrived. A large number of British troops, mostly from the 2nd Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and some French soldiers, were gathered and moved into a barn, a cowshed, at Esquelbec, near Wormhout. What happened inside that cowshed was not a battle. It was not an engagement. Approximately 80 men were killed with bullets and grenades by the SS troops who had placed them there. The exact number of men who died inside that barn has never been definitively established. There were survivors, men who escaped or were left for dead, who were later taken into custody by other German units, who were eventually repatriated and gave testimony. Their statements were recorded. The unit responsible was identified. The commander believed responsible was named. That name was Wilhelm Mohnke. He was never brought to trial. The German prosecutor who reviewed the case when it was reopened in 1988 concluded that there was insufficient evidence to bring charges. Mohnke himself denied it consistently until his death, telling historian Thomas Fischer, "I issued no orders not to take English prisoners or to execute prisoners." The cowshed at Esquelbec is now a memorial. The men buried as unknown in the British War Cemetery nearby are still there. The case is, formally, closed, because the last man who could answer for it died in 2001, aged 90, in a comfortable retirement facility. Mohnke was wounded again in the Balkans campaign. The German push into Yugoslavia and Greece began on the 6th of April 1941, the first day of the campaign. A Yugoslav air attack struck Mohnke's column, and the wound to his leg was severe. The medic's initial judgment was that the leg would need to be amputated. Mohnke overrode them. He refused amputation. The wound was serious enough that a part of his foot still had to be removed, but the leg itself was saved, a decision that spoke to a stubborn, physical willfulness that appears repeatedly in his biography. He was out of action for the better part of a year. On the 26th of December 1941, while still recuperating, he was awarded the German Cross in Gold. He returned to active service in 1942. The period of recovery was long enough that Mohnke later told historian Thomas Fischer he sometimes required strong painkillers, including morphine, to manage the persistent pain in his shortened right foot. Whether those medications affected his decision-making at any point during the war is not a question that can be answered with certainty. It is simply a fact, one that complicates the portrait of a man who is often rendered in purely two-dimensional terms, either as a decorated soldier following orders or as a war criminal who escaped justice. The reality, as is almost always the case with the human beings who end up at the center of historical catastrophe, is considerably more layered than either reduction allows. Mohnke was both a capable officer decorated multiple times by his superiors and a man about whom serious, documented allegations of atrocity were never fully resolved. Both things are true. The tension between them is part of the history. By the time Mohnke returned to service in 1942, the war had already shifted its center of gravity eastward. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, an operation of staggering scale, eventually involving several million soldiers on each side across a front that stretched thousands of kilometers. The Leibstans had been committed to the Eastern Front. The war in the West was, for the moment, stable. But the East was consuming men and equipment at a rate that no planner had prepared for, and the Leibstandarte was no exception. Mohnke returned to a unit that was already carrying the marks of that consumption, thinner on veterans, working harder to maintain the esprit de corps that had defined it in the early campaigns. He was assigned to a replacement battalion in March of 1942. He would not lead a frontline combat formation again until September of 1943. But when he did return to that role, it would be at the head of a regiment of very young men, fighting in the landscape of Normandy in the summer of 1944. And the allegations that followed from that campaign would add a second layer to the legal case against him that no prosecutor ever managed to close. Chapter 3. The Hitlerjugend Division. Building an Army from Children. On the 1st of September, 1943, 16,000 new recruits born in the year 1926 reported for formation as the newest division in the Waffen-SS. They were 17 years old. Most of them had never served a day in uniform outside of the Hitler Youth, the Hitlerjugend, the mass youth movement that had shaped their entire adolescence, the only framework of belonging that most of them had ever known. They had grown up in a Germany at war, had been raised on a doctrine of sacrifice and national destiny, and had now been handed weapons and unit designations and placed under the command of veterans from the Eastern Front, men who had already seen things that 17-year-olds should not be required to comprehend. This was the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, and on the 15th of September, 1943, Wilhelm Mohnke was given command of its 26th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment. The Hitlerjugend Division was not an improvised formation. Its creation had been planned and authorized at the highest levels, and considerable resources were directed toward equipping and training it. The senior NCOs and officers were generally drawn from Eastern Front veterans, men who had survived the winter campaigns, who knew what mechanized warfare at its most brutal looked like, and who were tasked with transforming a mass of teenage volunteers into something capable of holding a front line. Mohnke was brought in, not despite his age and experience, but because of it. He was, by this point, a proven combat officer. He had led men in Poland. He had commanded a battalion in France. He had been decorated twice and wounded more than once. He was the kind of officer the division needed at the regimental level, technically capable, personally tough, and deeply embedded in the loyalty culture of the Leibstandarte. He was also, by his own admission to historian Thomas Fischer, still managing significant chronic pain from the Balkan wound. The shortened foot, the recurring pain, the medication required to stay functional, these were not conditions that would have disqualified him from command in 1943, when the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS were consuming men faster than they could replace them. But they are part of the context. A man in chronic pain, commanding a regiment of 17-year-olds, heading toward one of the most intensely contested battlefields of the Western War. The picture that emerges is not the clean, idealized image of the decorated officer in the unit histories. It is something considerably more complicated and considerably more human, and therefore considerably harder to process simply. Mohnke was talked into taking the command by SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, a fellow veteran of the Leibstandarte, and a man who will appear in this story at several more critical junctions. Meyer told Mohnke he was free enough from pain to take the role. Mohnke agreed. The division spent the period between its formation in the autumn of 1943 and the following spring in training and preparation. It was a relatively stable interval, the last stable interval most of these men would ever experience. Allied planning for the invasion of northwestern France was well advanced by this point, though the precise date and location were still the subject of elaborate Allied deception operations designed to fix German attention on the wrong stretch of coastline. The Hitlerjugend division was stationed in France, and it was understood by the German High Command that it would form part of the response to whatever landing came. That landing came on the 6th of June 1944. The coast was Normandy, and everything that followed would define the remainder of the war in the West. The fighting around Caen in the weeks following the Normandy landings was among the most attritional of the entire Western campaign. The Hitlerjugend division, including Mohnke's 26th Regiment, was committed to holding the line against Allied forces that had more armor, more air support, and more room to absorb losses than the German defenders could match. The battles around Fontenay-le-Pesnel and the broader struggle to keep the Caen sector from collapsing consumed the division at a rate that left its roster almost unrecognizable within weeks. Mohnke's regiment held the brunt of Allied offensives from roughly the 10th to the 20th of June, a 10-day stretch that demonstrated both the defensive capability of his troops and the cost of that capability in human terms. For his leadership during this period, Mohnke was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross on the 11th of July, 1944. It was also in Normandy, specifically at Fontenay-le-Pesnel, that Mohnke was implicated in the killing of 35 Canadian prisoners of war. The details of what happened and of who gave what orders have been contested since the first post-war investigations began. Canadian authorities investigated the case after the war. As with the Wormhout allegations, no charges were ever brought. The evidence, investigators concluded, was insufficient to establish Mohnke's direct personal responsibility beyond the standard required for prosecution. Mohnke denied any involvement. The Canadian victims are part of a broader pattern of documented prisoner killings by units of the 12th SS Division in Normandy that investigators have examined from multiple angles for decades. The broader pattern of prisoner killings by Hitlerjugend units in Normandy in June of 1944 is historically documented. What remains contested is the precise chain of command responsibility at each incident. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the situation in Normandy deteriorated for the German forces. The attempt to keep the Falaise pocket open, to allow the encircled German forces to escape the Allied encirclement, cost the Hitlerjugend division somewhere between 40 and 50% of its strength. Mohnke withdrew his battle group east of the River Dives as the pocket closed. Then, as the front was pushed back toward the Seine, he organized resistance on the western bank to protect the river crossings, one of the few instances of effective German tactical management during the general collapse of the Normandy front. He was, by this assessment, not simply a war crime suspect. He was also a capable operational commander in a losing campaign, making the best of a deteriorating situation with the tools available to him. On the 31st of August, 1944, Mohnke was given command of the entire 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. He was replacing Theodor Wisch, who had been badly wounded. It was a significant appointment. The Leibstandarte was the flagship division of the Waffen-SS, the formation that had grown directly from the original Stabswache Berlin that Mohnke had joined as one of 117 men back in 1933. He had started at the very bottom of that organization. He was now its commander. In the intervening 11 years, he had been wounded multiple times, decorated repeatedly, and accumulated a biography that spanned the entire arc of the Third Reich's military history, from the ceremonial guard of the early 30s to the grinding attrition of a war that was now, clearly, being lost. The question was not whether Germany would lose. The question was what the losing would cost, and who would be left standing when it was over. By the autumn of 1944, the Leibstandarte had been rebuilt, partially, inadequately, and was being prepared for one final major offensive operation in the West. The planning had been underway for months at the highest levels. The target was the Ardennes, the forested hill country in Belgium and Luxembourg, where the Allied lines were thinly held. The objective was the port of Antwerp, a strategic prize whose capture, German planners argued, would split the Allied armies and buy Germany enough time to negotiate from something other than pure weakness. Mohnke would lead the Leibstandarte into that offensive. It would be his last major field command, and it would end not in Antwerp, not in any of the ambitious objectives drawn on the planning maps, but in a wounded withdrawal, a promotion, and an assignment that would place him at the very center of the war's final reckoning. But first, there was the Ardennes, and the Ardennes had its own terrible story to tell. Undercore. Chapter 4. The Ardennes. Last Gamble in the West. Undercore. The planning for what the Germans called Operation Watch on the Rhine, and what history would come to know primarily as the Battle of the Bulge, began in the deepest secrecy in the autumn of 1944. Hitler had conceived of it himself, over the objections of his senior commanders, who regarded the objective, a full armoured breakthrough to Antwerp, as militarily impossible given Germany's resources at that stage of the war. The fuel was insufficient, the replacement manpower was inadequate. The Allied air forces had achieved a degree of superiority over the Western battlefield that no amount of tactical cleverness could simply wish away. But Hitler was not, at this point, making decisions based on the measured assessment of operational feasibility. He was making decisions based on a kind of desperate logic that insisted one more audacious stroke could still reverse the tide. The commanders who told him otherwise found themselves sidelined. The ones who agreed, or who agreed loudly enough, were given the task of making it happen. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, under Wilhelm Mohnke, was attached to the 1st SS Panzer Corps for the operation. Mohnke's division was positioned as part of the spearhead, the armored formation tasked with breaking through the American lines and driving hard toward the Meuse River crossings, and beyond that, toward Antwerp. It was, on paper, the kind of assignment that the Leibstandarte had been built for, a deep armored thrust, relying on speed and shock to outrun the defender's ability to respond. In practice, it ran into problems almost immediately. The fuel crisis in Germany by late 1944 was acute, and the Lesser had insufficient fuel reserves for its vehicles before the offensive had even begun. The plan depended on capturing intact American fuel dumps along the route of advance to sustain the push. It was the kind of dependency that should have been a warning sign. The offensive began on the 16th of December 1944. The initial assault punched through the American lines, achieving local surprise. The leading element of the Leibstandarte, the battle group commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, moved fast through the confused American defense, and by 0700 hours, on the 17th of December, had seized an American fuel dump at Büllingen. It was a promising beginning, but 6.5 hours later, at 13:30, On that same 17th of December, at a crossroads near the Belgian town of Malmedy, something happened that would define the public memory of the Ardennes offensive as much as any tactical development on the map. Men from Piper's Leibstandarte formation shot and killed at least 68 United States Army prisoners of war. They were soldiers who had already surrendered. It became known as the Malmedy Massacre. Mohnke commanded the division of which Piper's battle group was a part. The legal and historical questions about command responsibility for the events at Malmedy, about who knew what, when, and whether any orders had been given that conditioned the behavior of the men who carried out the killings, were pursued after the war, through the Dachau military tribunals, and through subsequent investigations that continued for years. Those questions were complex, contested, and ultimately yielded convictions that were later reviewed, reduced, and in some cases overturned amid legal controversy. What is not contested is the event itself, or its basic character, or the fact that it occurred within Mohnke's divisional area of responsibility. The Malmedy case became one of the most legally complicated war crimes prosecutions of the post-war period, and Mohnke's name was part of the story, without ever becoming the primary focus of the Malmedy investigation itself. By the evening of the 17th of December, the leading elements of the Leibstandarte were engaged with the 99th United States Division at Stavelot, but the operation was already falling behind schedule. The retreating American troops had blown bridges and destroyed fuel dumps ahead of the German advance, denying Mohnke and Piper the resources they had counted on taking intact. By the end of the second day, the division was at least 36 hours behind its planned timetable. In an offensive where the entire strategic logic depended on speed, on moving faster than the Allies could respond, faster than the weather could change, faster than the fuel could run out, 36 hours was not a delay, it was a diagnosis. The operation was in trouble before the first week was done. The American resistance stiffened with each passing day. Allied air power, grounded in the first days of the offensive by fog and overcast, began to reassert itself as the weather shifted. Reinforcements arrived, divisions redirected from other sectors, including the famous airlift to Bastogne, that shaped the defensive line into something the German armored advance could no longer break through. By the 24th of December, the advance had halted. Christmas in the Ardennes, 1944. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Führer's own division, stopped cold in Belgian snow, short of every major objective, surrounded by a landscape of destroyed equipment and exhausted men. The 1,000-year empire was running out of not just fuel, but time. On the 1st of January 1945, the Luftwaffe launched a series of attacks on Allied airfields in an attempt to recover some measure of air superiority, an operation that proved very costly for the already depleted German air forces. The losses could not be replaced. The Allied armies had regrouped and were ready to repulse any further German attacks. The Ardennes offensive formally ended on the 27th of January, 1945. 3 days later, on the 30th of January, Wilhelm Mohnke was promoted to SS Brigadeführer, the rank he would hold for the remainder of the war. It was, in retrospect, a strange kind of recognition, a promotion awarded at the moment of a failed offensive, in the deepest winter of a war that was now beyond any real question of recovery. A short time after the promotion, the Leibstandarte and the 1st SS Panzer Corps were transferred to Hungary, where the situation on the Eastern Front was deteriorating rapidly, and German commanders were attempting to hold together a defense with formations that had been shattered in the Ardennes. Mohnke did not make it to Hungary in command. He was injured in an air raid. This time, the damage was to his hearing, ear damage severe enough to remove him from frontline service. He was placed on the Führer Reserve, the pool of senior officers held in readiness for reassignment, neither commanding nor inactive, waiting for whatever came next. For Mohnke, what came next was Berlin. And Berlin, in the spring of 1945, was the end of everything, or the beginning of everything else, depending on how you measured survival. The man who had started as a carpenter's son from Lübeck, who had signed his name to the party rolls in 1931 and been chosen for the personal guard in 1933, who had commanded companies, battalions, regiments, and ultimately a full division across 6 years of total war. That man was now recovering from his wounds in a city that the Allied air forces were reducing to rubble on a near-nightly basis, waiting for his next orders. Those orders, when they came, were signed by Hitler himself. They were direct, they were specific, and they placed Wilhelm Mohnke at the very center of the final act of the Third Reich, in the deepest bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, commanding what remained of the government district's defense, as the Soviet First Belarusian and First Ukrainian fronts closed in from the east and south. The last chapter of the war was about to begin, and Mohnke was going to be inside it, all the way to the end. Chapter 5. Appointed to the ruins. The Berlin Command. Berlin, in the spring of 1945, was a city being consumed by two things simultaneously: the Allied bombing campaign from above, and the approaching Soviet armies from the east and south. By April, the question for most of Berlin's remaining military commanders was not how to hold the city, but how to manage the collapse, how to delay the inevitable long enough for whatever fragments of a plan still existed to play out, whether that meant negotiating a surrender on the western side, where the Anglo-American forces were considered a less brutal captor than the Soviets, or simply holding out until the last possible moment, because the orders from the Führerbunker demanded it. Wilhelm Mohnke was not involved in the political calculations of those final weeks. He was a soldier, he was given an assignment, and he carried it out with the same disciplined, methodical approach he had brought to every previous assignment in his career, even when the assignment was, by any rational military assessment, impossible. Hitler appointed Mohnke personally as Kampfkommandant, battle commander, for the defense of the central government district of Berlin, the sector designated Citadel. The appointment was made after Mohnke had recovered sufficiently from his ear injury to resume active service. The Citadel sector was the innermost ring of Berlin's defense, the nerve center, containing the Reich Chancellery, the Führerbunker itself, the propaganda ministry, and the surrounding government buildings. If anything in Berlin could be said to matter more than anything else, it was this. And Hitler, characteristically, assigned it to a man he trusted absolutely, one of the original members of the Leibstandarte, a veteran of every major campaign, a soldier who had never given Hitler cause to doubt his loyalty. Mohnke's command post was established in the bunker system beneath the Reich Chancellery. He formed his fighting force, Kampfgruppe Mohnke, Combat Group Mohnke, from whatever was available. The Leibstandarte Flak Company, replacements from the Leibstandarte's training and replacement battalion at Spreenhagen, under SS Standartenführer Anhalt, 600 men from the Begleitbataillon Reichsführer SS, the Führer Begleitkompanie, and the core fighting unit of 800 men from the Leibstandarte SS Guard Battalion, assigned to protect the Führer directly. Together, this assembled force was organized into 2 weak regiments. It was not a conventional military formation. It was a patchwork, a collection of units brought together under a single command structure by the velocity of catastrophe rather than by any coherent order of battle. General Helmuth Weidling had been appointed by Hitler as the overall defense commandant of Berlin, but Mohnke's command was structured as an exception. He remained free of Weidling's authority in matters relating to the defense of the Reich Chancellery and the Führerbunker. It was a command arrangement that made sense only within the logic of Hitler's Berlin, the Führer's personal guard, defending the Führer's personal space, answered to the Führer's personal chain of command, not to the general officer nominally running the city's defense. Mohnke had direct access to Hitler. He briefed him regularly on the tactical situation in the Citadel sector. He was present at conferences in the bunker during those final days, an eyewitness to the internal drama of the Nazi leadership's last hours, in a way that very few people, anywhere, were in a position to witness. The combined defending force for Berlin, Mohnke's SS Kampfgruppe, combined with Weidling's 56th Panzer Corps, and the other scattered units, totaled roughly 45,000 soldiers and 40,000 Volkssturm, the civilian militia that had been scraped together from men too old, too young, or too infirm for regular military service. Against them, the Soviet forces allocated for the assault on Berlin numbered approximately 1.5 million soldiers. The arithmetic was not complicated. It was not a balance of forces that invited strategic creativity. It was an encirclement in which the question was not the outcome, but the duration. Every day the Citadel sector held was a day purchased at a cost that the defenders were paying in lives, and a cost that the surrounding civilian population was paying in ways that no military history can fully account for. The artillery bombardment that would define the final weeks began on the 20th of April, 1945, Hitler's birthday. It was a grim coincidence, or perhaps not a coincidence at all, that the Soviet forces chose that date to begin the sustained bombardment of the government district. For the men in Mohnke's command, and for the civilians still in the city, it was the beginning of an ordeal that would last until the 2nd of May. Street fighting around the Reichstag and the Reich Chancellery was close range and savage, block by block, building by building, the kind of urban combat that turns architecture into a weapon and reduces the logic of conventional military engagement to something closer to organized chaos. For the Soviets, the Reichstag carried enormous symbolic weight. It was the parliament of the Germany they had bled to defeat, and capturing it was a matter of political significance that went far beyond any tactical calculation. Inside the bunker, the human drama that accompanied the military one was reaching its own terminal velocity. On the 22nd of April, Hitler had his final strategic conference, the meeting at which it became undeniable to everyone present that no relief was coming, that the formations that had been ordered to advance on Berlin were either destroyed, encircled, or simply no longer capable of the operation that had been demanded of them. Hitler's response, according to multiple accounts from those who were present, was an eruption of rage and grief that marked the end of any pretense that the war could still be shaped by will alone. After that conference, the inner circle of the bunker, secretaries, adjutants, medical staff, party officials, military commanders, began to reckon with the reality that they were in a trap of their own making, beneath a city that was being destroyed above their heads. Mohnke was not merely a spectator to these events. He was an active participant in them. When SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's personal representative at Hitler's headquarters, married to Eva Braun's sister, was discovered to have left the bunker without authorization, Hitler ordered a court-martial. Mohnke was appointed to preside over the tribunal. The other judges were Generals Hans Krebs, Wilhelm Burgdorf, and Johann Rattenhuber. What happened at that court-martial, as Mohnke later described it to author James P. O'Donnell, was a scene of such grotesque disintegration that the proceedings could not even properly begin. Fegelein arrived drunk, incoherent, physically ill, challenging the court's authority and then collapsing into helplessness. Mohnke closed the proceedings, citing the military manual's requirement that a defendant must be in sound mental and physical condition to stand trial. He handed Fegelein over to SS General Rattenhuber. He never saw Fegelein again. Fegelein was shot shortly afterward. It is a detail that illuminates the nature of the command environment Mohnke was operating in during those final days. He was being asked to convene courts-martial in a bunker under artillery fire, to manage the defense of a city that was collapsing around him, and to maintain some kind of military order in a context where order was dissolving faster than any organizational chart could keep pace with. He was also, in those days, one of the last general officers with direct access to Hitler, one of the very few people who saw, firsthand, the full disintegration of the Nazi leadership in its final form. What he saw, he kept largely to himself. What he remembered, he disclosed selectively and cautiously in later years, in small pieces, to a small number of historians. What he took with him when he died in 2001, no one can say. Underscore. Chapter 6. The Final Hours. Hitler is dead. Underscore. The 30th of April, 1945, was a Monday. In Berlin, above the bunker, the Soviet forces had advanced to within a very short distance of the Reich Chancellery itself. The sounds of small arms fire and tank engines were audible from inside the bunker complex. The fighting had moved from the outer districts to the immediate neighborhood of the government district, street by street, block by block. The city's defenders, Mohnke's Kampfgruppe, the remnants of Weidling's Panzer Corps, the Volkssturm, the foreign volunteer SS units, the Hitler Youth Boys pressed into service with anti-tank weapons, were being compressed into an ever smaller perimeter. The outer rings of the Citadel sector had already been penetrated. The end was not coming. It was already here. At some point in the early afternoon of that 30th of April, Adolf Hitler ate lunch with his secretaries. He moved through the bunker, shaking hands with members of the staff, a small, formal leave-taking that those who were present would describe in their later accounts with a quality of unreality, as if the scene were taking place slightly outside the normal flow of time. In the afternoon, he went to his private rooms. At some point in the period between the early and mid-afternoon hours, the sounds from Hitler's rooms told those outside what had happened. SS Sturmbannführer Otto Günsche, Hitler's personal adjutant, went to inform Mohnke. Mohnke received the news. He took it in, and then he did what soldiers do. He turned to the operational problem immediately in front of him. Prior orders had been discussed and established in the preceding days. In the event of Hitler's death, those who could do so were to attempt to break out from the Soviet encirclement and reach either the Allied forces on the western side of the Elbe or the remaining German forces to the north. Mohnke convened a conference with the commanders he could reach within the Citadel sector and briefed them on Hitler's death and on the breakout plan. He organized the surviving personnel of the bunker complex, military, civilian, and administrative staff alike, into 10 main groups. The groups would leave at intervals, using different routes, to reduce the probability that any single Soviet patrol could interdict the entire breakout. It was a methodical, professionally organized evacuation plan, the work of a man who had spent his career practicing the management of men in crisis, now applying that practice to the most personally consequential crisis of his own life. Mohnke's own group included some of the most historically significant individuals remaining in the bunker. Among those who left with him were Traudl Jung, one of Hitler's personal secretaries, who would later write one of the most important first-hand accounts of the bunker's final weeks. Gerda Christian, another of Hitler's secretaries, Elsa Kruger, Constanze Manziarli, Hitler's dietitian, Dr. Ernst Günther Schenk, who had been operating a medical post in the bunker, and Walter Hürvel of the Foreign Office. Also in the group was Otto Günsche, who had just informed Mohnke of Hitler's death. It was a group of perhaps a dozen people, plus whatever military escort could be assembled, moving through the ruins of Berlin at night, on foot, through a city occupied by an enemy army. The breakout began on the night of the 1st of May. Mohnke's plan was to reach the German army positioned to the north. in the direction of Prinzenallee. The group entered the subway tunnels beneath Berlin, where thousands of civilians and soldiers had sought shelter from the bombardment. They moved along the tunnel system for a time, but their intended route was blocked, either by Soviet forces, by collapsed sections of tunnel, or by the sheer confusion of a city in its final hours of battle. The group came back above ground. They made their way through the rubble and the burning streets, joining hundreds of other German civilians and military personnel who had converged on the Schultheiss-Patzenhofer brewery on Prinzenallee. The brewery was large enough to shelter significant numbers and had become, in the chaotic geography of the breakout, a kind of unofficial assembly point. On the 2nd of May, General Weidling issued his order for the complete surrender of all German forces remaining in Berlin. Mohnke, at the brewery, received the order, or learned of it, through whatever communication was still functioning. He assessed the situation. The Soviet encirclement was complete, the routes north were blocked, and no German forces were within reach of those attempting to break out. He made the decision to surrender to the Red Army. Several members of his group, including some of the SS personnel, chose suicide over capture. It is a detail that requires no elaboration. The world that those men had served, and that had shaped their identities entirely, had ceased to exist. Whatever came next was something they had not prepared themselves to face. For those who surrendered with Mohnke, the immediate aftermath was neither brutal nor deliberately humiliating, at least at first. The German officers, including Mohnke and Dr. Schenk, were taken to the headquarters of Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 8th Guards Army, the formation that had fought its way from Stalingrad to Berlin. There, with the permission of Chuikov's chief of staff, Mohnke and the other senior German officers were offered a banquet. It was a gesture that spoke to the complex protocols of military courtesy that persist even in the most extreme circumstances. A recognition of rank, perhaps, or simply the human instinct to mark a moment of total historical significance with something other than violence. The banquet ended. The Germans were ushered into an adjoining room. Armed guards took their posts. On the night of the 3rd of May, Mohnke and the remaining Germans were handed over to the Jentvödsy, the Soviet secret police. The transition from Chuikov's military custody to encrevered custody marked the end of whatever qualified respect the military handover had offered. On the 9th of May, Mohnke was flown to Moscow. He was taken to Lubyanka prison, the Senkvady's main interrogation facility, a building whose name, by 1945, carried its own unmistakable weight of implication. He was held in solitary confinement for 6 years. Then he was transferred to the officers' prison camp at Voikovo, where he remained until the 10th of October 1955, 10 years after his capture, a decade in Soviet custody, waiting for a world that had reorganized itself entirely in his absence to decide what to do with him. He was 44 years old when he was captured. He was 44 years old when he was captured. He was, in the most precise sense, a man who had survived everything: the campaigns, the wounds, the war, the bunker, the breakout, the captivity, and who now had to find a way to inhabit the life that all of that survival had left him. What that life looked like. What a man who had stood at the center of history's most catastrophic decade made of the decades that followed, and what justice, or the failure of it, ultimately meant for the men and women who had been on the other side of his commands. Those are the questions that the chapters ahead will pursue. The bunker is empty now. The war is 70-some years behind us. But the story is not finished. It never really is. Chapter 7. Into the Silence. Soviet captivity begins. There is a particular quality to the silence that follows the end of a war, not the silence of peace, which is expansive and full of possibility, but the silence of collapse, which is narrow and airless, and weighted with everything that has been lost. For the men taken into Soviet custody in the first days of May 1945, that silence was not metaphorical. It was architectural. It was the silence of Lubyanka prison in Moscow. Stone walls, narrow corridors, the muffled quality of sound in a building designed to contain men and information with equal thoroughness. Wilhelm Mohnke arrived at Lubyanka on approximately the 9th of May 1945, the same day that Germany's unconditional surrender was formally ratified in Berlin, the day the Soviet Union would later designate as Victory Day. For Mohnke, it was not a day of endings. It was a day of beginnings, the beginning of 10 years in captivity, in a country whose language he did not speak, in institutions whose purposes he could only partially guess at, surrounded by an apparatus of interrogation and detention that had been refined over decades into something very effective at extracting what it wanted from the men placed inside it. Lubyanka was not an ordinary prison. It was the central interrogation facility of the Mean Guidi, the Soviet state security apparatus, and it had processed, over the course of its history, some of the most politically significant prisoners in Soviet hands. The men held there were not held because they were simply enemies. They were held because they were believed to have information about military operations, about German command structures, about the decisions made in the final months and weeks of the Third Reich, about who had ordered what and when, and with what consequences. Mohnke, as a senior SS general who had been present in the Führerbunker during Hitler's final days, and who had commanded the defense of the Reich Chancellery, was as valuable an intelligence asset as the Soviets could reasonably have hoped to acquire from the Berlin ruins. He knew things. The NKVD wanted to know what he knew, and it had all the time in the world. The interrogation process at Lubyanka was, by the accounts of those who survived it, methodical and exhausting in ways that differed from physical torture, primarily in the precision of the psychological pressure applied. Prisoners were kept on irregular sleep schedules, interrogated at unexpected hours, confronted with information the interrogators had gathered from other sources, and pressed to confirm, contradict, or elaborate on whatever the Soviet intelligence services already believed they knew. For a man like Mohnke, trained in the SS ethos of absolute loyalty and the preservation of organizational secrets, the process was a slow contest of wills, conducted entirely in a foreign language through interpreters, with no access to legal counsel, no contact with family, and no clear timeline that would tell him how long it would last. He was held in solitary confinement for 6 years. 6 years in which the world outside continued. Germany was divided, rebuilt, reoriented. The Nuremberg trials concluded. The Cold War took shape. The men who had served alongside him either faced justice, escaped it, or quietly found their way back into civilian life. And Mohnke sat in a cell, answering questions, or refusing to answer them, or managing the careful arithmetic of what to concede and what to hold. The precise content of his interrogations at Lubyanka has never been fully made public. Soviet archival materials relating to the interrogation of senior German prisoners remain only partially accessible to historians, even now, decades after the end of the Cold War. What is known from the accounts of other prisoners who were held at Lubyanka during overlapping periods, and from the limited documentary record that has emerged, is that the interrogations focused heavily on the events in the Führerbunker, on the question of whether Hitler was truly dead, on the circumstances of the deaths of Hitler and Eva Braun, on what had happened to the bodies, and on what Mohnke had directly witnessed in those final hours. The Soviets had a specific institutional interest in establishing, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Hitler was dead, because Stalin himself harbored a persistent suspicion that Hitler might have escaped, that the body identified in the Reich Chancellery garden might not have been Hitler's, Mohnke was one of a small number of witnesses who could address those questions from direct, first-hand experience. That made him valuable. It also meant he was not going anywhere quickly. He was also questioned, in all likelihood, about the operational details of the Citadel defense and the breakout, about the routes used, the forces deployed, the communications with the wider German command structure in the final days. This was standard military intelligence work, the kind of debriefing that every captured senior officer could expect, regardless of the political dimension of his captivity. But for Mohnke, the political dimension was never absent. He was not simply a general who had lost a battle. He was an SS general, a member of an organization that the Nuremberg Tribunal would later declare a criminal organization in its entirety, who had commanded forces implicated in atrocities on multiple fronts across the entire span of the war. The Soviets were aware of the Wormhout allegations, the Normandy allegations, and the broader pattern of conduct by Leibstandarte and Hitlerjugend units that the post-war investigations were beginning to document. Whether those matters were raised directly with Mohnke during his Lubyanka interrogations, and what he said about them, remains unknown. After 6 years of solitary confinement, Mohnke was transferred from Lubyanka to the officers' prison camp at Voikovo, a facility in the Soviet interior that held senior German military and SS prisoners during the post-war decade. The transfer, whenever exactly it occurred, in the early 1950s, represented a significant change in conditions. Voikovo was a camp, not a solitary cell. There were other German officers present. There was the possibility of human interaction, of conversation, of shared experience that could anchor a man's sense of identity and sanity in a way that solitary confinement, by definition, denied. For Mohnke, it also meant encounters with men who had served in different capacities across the German military machine. Wehrmacht generals, other Waffen-SS commanders, Luftwaffe officers, men who had shared the broad experience of the war from different vantage points, and who were now, like Mohnke, suspended in a kind of historical limbo, while the world outside decided what it intended to do about them. The conditions at Voikovo were better than Lubyanka, though better, in this context, meant something quite limited. Prisoners were allowed some communication with family. Food was more regular. The political pressure of continuous interrogation was reduced, replaced by the slower, grinding pressure of indefinite detention, of not knowing whether the months ahead would bring release or another decade of the same. Mohnke spent roughly 3 to 4 years at Voikovo before his release. The men held alongside him included figures whose names appear throughout the history of the Waffen-SS and the Wehrmacht High Command. Men who had fought on the same fronts, served in overlapping commands, and who were now sharing the particular experience of having outlasted the war and the regime that had made them, only to find themselves held by one of the victorious powers, while the other victorious powers rebuilt the country they had helped to destroy. The question that a man held in those circumstances eventually must confront, if he has the capacity for honest self-examination, is the question of responsibility, not legal responsibility, which is a narrow and particular thing, shaped by evidence standards and procedural requirements and the availability of witnesses, but moral responsibility, which is broader and less forgiving, and which operates independently of whether a prosecutor can make a case. The evidence available to us suggests that Mohnke, over the course of his decade in Soviet captivity, resolved that question in a particular way. He maintained that he had followed orders, that the specific allegations against him were either fabricated or misattributed, and that whatever had happened in France and Normandy was either the responsibility of other men or a consequence of combat conditions that could not be judged fairly by those who had not been there. Whether that resolution came from genuine conviction or from the psychological necessity of maintaining a coherent self-image through 10 years of isolation and detention, or from both simultaneously. That is not a question that any external observer can answer on his behalf. It is simply part of the record. On the 10th of October, 1955, Wilhelm Mohnke was released from Soviet captivity and returned to West Germany. He was the last of the high-ranking SS officers from the Führerbunker to be released. The Adenauer government had been negotiating with Moscow for the return of the remaining German prisoners of war, men who were still being held a full decade after the war's end, without trial, without charges, in Soviet camps whose very existence was only partially acknowledged by the Soviet government. The negotiations concluded. The final transports came home, and among those who stepped off the trains in West Germany in the autumn of 1955 was a 54-year-old man who had last seen his country when it was a burning ruin, who had spent 10 years in a foreign prison, and who now faced the task of finding out what, if anything, remained for him in the country he had spent his entire adult life serving. What he found was a West Germany that had been rebuilt with remarkable speed and with a collective social determination to set the immediate past at a careful distance, to keep it visible enough for formal commemoration and legal process, but not so visible that it disrupted the work of reconstruction and the resumption of ordinary life. Mohnke settled back into that Germany. He found work, he built a life, and he kept, for the most part, a silence that the investigators who would come after him in the following decades would find enormously, durably frustrating. Undercore. Chapter 8. The New Germany. Silence as Strategy. Underscore. West Germany in the middle 1950s was a country in motion, economically, politically, and psychologically. The economic reconstruction that came to be called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was generating growth rates that were transforming the country from rubble into prosperity at a pace that surprised even those managing it. Cities that had been flattened were rebuilding, industries were restarting, and a generation of men who had returned from the front or from captivity were finding their way back into civilian employment, into family life, into the rhythms of peacetime existence, with a determination that was itself a form of survival. For some, this transition was straightforward. For others, particularly those carrying the specific weight of senior SS service, or of allegations that had not been formally resolved, but had not been formally closed either, the transition was a more complicated negotiation between the past and the present. Mohnke settled in Hamburg. He found work in a motor vehicle dealership, selling trucks, according to the accounts of those who knew him in his later years. It was unglamorous, practical work, the kind of employment that kept a man busy and visible in a commercial sense, while rendering him invisible in any politically significant sense. There was nothing about selling trucks in Hamburg that attracted the attention of newspapers, or historians, or judicial authorities. It was a life chosen, at least in part, for its ordinariness, the ordinariness of a man who wanted, more than anything, to be left alone, to complete whatever remained of his life, outside the sightlines of the people who were still, in the 1950s and 60s, looking for men like him. Whether that choice reflected guilt, pragmatism, exhaustion, or simply the natural human desire for quiet after 30 years of extreme experience, is not something that can be determined from the outside. It was, however, a choice that proved remarkably durable. The Federal Republic of Germany had inherited a legal system that contained, from its earliest years, a profound tension around the question of prosecuting former members of the Nazi state and armed forces. On one hand, the country's formal commitment to denazification and to accountability for the crimes of the regime was real and documented. The Nuremberg trials had established the legal framework. The basic law of the new republic had incorporated human rights protections that were explicitly designed to prevent the recurrence of what had happened, and German courts did pursue prosecutions of individual perpetrators throughout the 1950s and beyond. On the other hand, the practical, social, and political pressures that made those prosecutions difficult were equally real. Witnesses had died, documents had been destroyed or scattered across multiple jurisdictions. The men who had served in the Wehrmacht and the SS had reintegrated into society and, in many cases, into positions of professional and civic responsibility. Pursuing them required a sustained political will that fluctuated considerably depending on which government was in power and what other priorities were competing for judicial resources. The establishment of the Central Office of the State Justice Administrations for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, known by its German initials as the ZSL, at Ludwigsburg in the autumn of 1958, represented a formal, institutionalized commitment to sustained prosecution. The ZSL was created specifically to coordinate investigations across the different state-level prosecutors, to maintain a central registry of cases, and to ensure that the fragmentation of the German federal system did not allow perpetrators to escape investigation simply by residing in one state, while their alleged crimes occurred in territory now belonging to another legal jurisdiction. It was a significant institutional development, and it meant that men like Mohnke, whose alleged crimes had occurred outside German territory, in France and Belgium and Normandy, but who were now living in West Germany, came within the ZSL's scope of interest. The British had been the first to investigate Mohnke seriously for the Wormhout killings. In the immediate post-war period, British military investigators had gathered statements from survivors of the barn massacre at Eskelbeck and had constructed a case file that named Mohnke as the responsible commander. The case had not proceeded to prosecution for a combination of reasons: insufficient direct evidence to meet the standard required for a conviction, the difficulty of gathering witnesses who were scattered across several countries, and the broader political and logistical constraints that limited the capacity of post-war military tribunals to process all the cases that had been identified. The file was maintained, it was not forgotten, but it was also not pursued with the urgency that a fresh case with living witnesses and readily available evidence might have been. The West German authorities, when they eventually turned their attention formally to the Wormhout case in the 1960s, and again in the 1980s, faced the same evidentiary constraints that had stopped the British investigation, compounded by the passage of time. Witnesses aged and died. Memories, even honest ones, shifted over decades. The documentary record for what had happened in those chaotic days around Dunkirk in late May of 1945, in the compressed and fragmentary paperwork of a mobile campaign, was incomplete. And Mohnke himself, when approached and questioned, maintained a consistent and detailed denial of personal involvement or direct responsibility. He was not simply evasive. He engaged, in a limited way, with the historical record, giving selective interviews, speaking to historians on his own terms, presenting himself as a soldier who had been falsely accused, while acknowledging, with the careful hedging of a man who had thought very hard about what he was willing to say, that terrible things had occurred in the general vicinity of his command during those days. The 1960s brought a broader reckoning with the Nazi past in West Germany, driven partly by the generational shift that placed the children of the war years into positions of political and cultural influence, partly by high-profile cases like the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, which forced a renewed public engagement with the systematic nature of the crimes committed under the Third Reich. The Auschwitz trials in Frankfurt, which ran from December of 1963 through August of 1965, were perhaps the most significant domestic German legal proceeding to grapple with these issues. A marathon prosecution that placed the machinery of mass killing before a German court and generated enormous public and international attention. Against this backdrop, the specific question of Waffen-SS battlefield conduct, of what had happened at Wormhout, at Malmedy, in Normandy, sat in a different legal and moral register than the final solution, but was not entirely separate from it either. The SS was the SS. The organization was the organization, and the men who had served in it, at every level, were increasingly required to account for that service, in ways that the Wirtschaftswunder years had allowed many of them to defer. For Mohnke, the 1960s and 1970s passed without formal legal proceedings. He was not charged. He was not indicted. He was investigated, in the sense that his name appeared in files maintained by multiple investigative authorities in multiple countries. But he was not brought into a courtroom. He continued to live in Hamburg, to work, and to maintain the quiet of a man who had decided that the best defense available to him was the consistent, undramatic, unremarkable conduct of an ordinary civilian life. He also, gradually, began to speak, in the limited, controlled way of a man who knew that total silence was its own kind of vulnerability, that it invited speculation and imputation in ways that a carefully managed, partial disclosure might moderate. He gave an interview to historian James P. O'Donnell, whose 1978 book on the Berlin bunker drew on conversations with numerous surviving members of the bunker circle. He spoke with Thomas Fisher, whose research into the Alsace produced some of the most detailed biographical material available on Mohnke's pre-war career. He was selective, he was thoughtful, and he remained, throughout, consistent in his denials of the specific allegations against him. It was a strategy, if it can be called that, of partial engagement, of controlled visibility. He would allow himself to become a historical figure, accessible enough to shape the historical record, closed enough to prevent any new evidence from emerging that might reopen the legal questions. Whether it was a consciously designed strategy or simply a natural expression of his temperament, the methodical, patient, organizationally minded temperament that had carried him from a management position at a porcelain company in Lübeck to the command of the Führerbunker's defense, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that it worked. In the purely functional sense, he was never prosecuted. He lived to 90, and the men who had died in that barn in northern France, and at that crossroads near Malmedy, and in the fields of Normandy, they remained, for Mohnke's lifetime and beyond, the subject of historical inquiry rather than of legal resolution. That is not an accident. It is a consequence, and the distinction matters. Underscore, underscore, underscore. Chapter 9. The Investigators. 3 countries, 1 name. Score. A ticking, methodical rhythm. The sound of archival pages being turned. Of Helm. The case against Wilhelm Mohnke, or rather, the accumulation of cases, from 3 separate countries, across more than 5 decades of investigative effort, represents one of the most sustained and ultimately inconclusive attempts to achieve legal accountability for alleged wartime conduct in the entire history of post-war justice. It is not a story of obstruction in the obvious sense. There was no single dramatic moment at which a document was destroyed, or a witness silenced, or a judge compromised. It is a story of attrition, the slow erosion of evidentiary sufficiency over decades, the accumulation of procedural and jurisdictional obstacles that, taken individually, might each have been surmountable, but taken together, proved to be more than any investigation could overcome. Understanding why requires understanding how war crimes investigations actually work, not in the simplified moral logic of justice versus impunity, but in the specific, technical, deeply human reality of gathering evidence about events that happened in chaos, decades ago, in foreign countries, from witnesses who are aging, scattered, and in some cases no longer alive. The British investigation into the Wormhout massacre was the earliest and the most specifically focused on Mohnke by name. It began in the immediate post-war period, drawing on statements from British survivors of the Esquelbecq barn killings, men who had been inside the cowshed, who had survived by chance or by the particular geometry of how the grenades had fallen, and who had emerged with direct testimony about what had happened and who had been responsible. The statements gathered in the years immediately after the war were detailed and consistent in their core factual claims that British and French prisoners of war had been placed in a barn and killed with grenades and small arms fire by members of the Lissars 2nd Battalion, that the order to move the prisoners had come from the battalion commander, and that the battalion commander at the time of the killings was Wilhelm Mohnke. The evidentiary chain, as far as it went, was reasonably well constructed. The problem was where it stopped, establishing that an order was given by a specific named officer, in the specific form, and at the specific time required by a criminal prosecution, is a much more demanding evidentiary standard than establishing that an atrocity occurred and that the battalion commander's unit was responsible. The survivors of the barn could describe what had happened to them. They could name the formation whose personnel had put them there. They could describe the conduct they had witnessed. What they could not do, with the specificity that a court required, was testify directly to a specific order issued by a specific individual at a specific moment. The chain of command inference, that if Mohnke commanded the battalion and the battalion's personnel committed the killings, then Mohnke was criminally responsible, was legally sound as a theory. But in a criminal prosecution, theories require evidence, and the evidence of a direct command or of Mohnke's personal presence at or direction of the killings was not available in the form the law required. The Canadian investigations into the killings of Canadian prisoners of war in Normandy in June of 1944 followed a similar trajectory. The killings, most of which were attributed to personnel of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, including units under Mohnke's regimental command, were documented by Canadian military investigators in the immediate post-war period. The investigating officer concluded that there was sufficient evidence to bring charges against several named SS officers. Mohnke was among those named, but the specific evidentiary requirements of a criminal prosecution, direct evidence of orders, or of Mohnke's personal involvement in specific incidents, were again difficult to establish to the standard required. Some of the other named officers were prosecuted. Brigade Führer Kurt Meyer, Mohnke's fellow Leibstandarte veteran who had talked him into taking the Hitlerjugend regimental command, was tried by a Canadian military court in December of 1945, convicted of responsibility for the killings of Canadian prisoners, and sentenced to death, a sentence that was later commuted to life imprisonment and further reduced, resulting in Meyer's release in 1954. The difference between Meyer's prosecution and Mohnke's non-prosecution was, in the assessment of the investigators, a difference in the evidentiary record available for each man, not a difference in the nature of what each was alleged to have done. West German prosecutors opened formal investigations into Mohnke on multiple occasions. The Staatsanwaltschaft in Hamburg, the state prosecutor's office in the city where Mohnke lived, was the primary venue for these proceedings, since German law required prosecution in the jurisdiction of the suspect's residence when the alleged crimes had occurred outside Germany's current borders. The Hamburg prosecutor reviewed the Wormhout case in the 1960s. The case was reopened more formally in 1988, following renewed pressure from British survivors' organizations and from historians who had been building the documentary record over the preceding decade. The 1988 investigation was the most thorough German domestic examination of the Wormhout allegations. It drew on the original British investigative files, on testimony gathered over 4 decades, on the oral history accounts that had been collected by journalists and historians, and on whatever documentation remained in the German military archives. The conclusion, reached after a multi-year examination, was that the evidence remained insufficient to bring charges that could be sustained in a German criminal court. The case was closed. Not cleared, closed. There is a distinction, and the German prosecutors were careful to maintain it. They did not find that Mohnke was innocent. They found that they could not prove he was guilty to the standard the law required. The broader context for these investigations was a West German legal system that, in the 1980s and beyond, was making genuine and sustained efforts to prosecute Nazi-era crimes. Efforts that were imperfect and inconsistent, but that were real. The ZSL at Ludwigsburg had, by the 1980s, built a substantial institutional capacity for investigating and preparing cases relating to wartime atrocities. German courts had convicted perpetrators at every level of the killing apparatus. The argument that German domestic courts simply would not or could not prosecute former SS officers, an argument that had more validity in the 1950s than it did by the 1980s, was not a full explanation for the Mohnke outcome. The explanation was, more specifically, evidentiary. The combination of time elapsed, witnesses deceased or aged, and documentation lost or incomplete, had produced a factual record that fell short of what a criminal prosecution required, even when the historical record strongly suggested that serious crimes had been committed within the area of Mohnke's command. For the survivors of those crimes, and for the families of those who had not survived, the distinction between insufficient evidence and innocent was not a comfort. The men who had died in the barn at Esquelbecq and the Canadian soldiers killed in the fields around Caen had families who had spent decades seeking some form of acknowledgement, some form of formal accountability that the legal processes had consistently failed to deliver. The British veterans' organisations that had sustained the pressure for investigation of the Wormhout case across 5 decades were not satisfied by the 1988 closure. They continued to speak publicly about what had happened. They continued to mark the anniversary of the killings at the Esquelbecq Memorial. They continued to name Mohnke as the responsible officer, and they did so publicly, and he was alive to hear them. That public naming, that insistence on a form of accountability that did not require a courtroom, was itself a kind of justice, limited and unsatisfying, but real in its way. The legal landscape changed briefly in the 1990s, when Mohnke's case attracted renewed attention in the context of broader efforts to prosecute elderly former Nazis who had lived undisturbed lives in West Germany. The British authorities revisited the Wormhout file once more, following the publication of new historical research that provided additional context and detail. The conclusion was consistent with all the previous reviews. The evidentiary standard required for a criminal prosecution could not be met. Mohnke was by this point in his 80s, an old man living quietly in a care facility, no longer capable of the public life that might have made a renewed investigation politically pressing in the way that high-profile cases involving active public figures became pressing. The machinery of justice, having ground over him for 5 decades without finding the precise purchase it needed, eventually moved on to other cases where the evidentiary record was more complete. The frustration that this outcome generates, the moral frustration of a gap between what the historical record suggests and what the legal record was able to establish, is a frustration that runs through a great deal of post-war justice history. It is not unique to Mohnke. It appears in dozens of cases involving Waffen-SS officers, concentration camp guards, Einsatzgruppen commanders, and the broader population of men who had participated in crimes of varying directness and scale, and who had survived long enough to grow old in a society that was genuinely, if imperfectly, attempting to come to terms with what had been done in its name. What the Mohnke case illustrates with particular clarity is the way in which time, the sheer passage of years, operates as a form of impunity that requires no active concealment, no conspiracy, no destruction of evidence, only the willingness to remain quiet and wait. Mohnke waited, and the years did what years do. The lesson, if there is one, is not about Mohnke specifically. It is about the architecture of accountability, about the conditions that need to be present for justice to function, and about what happens when those conditions are not met. Evidence must be gathered quickly before witnesses die and memories fade. Investigations must be pursued with sustained political will, not opened and closed in response to external pressure. And the gap between historical responsibility and legal culpability, between what the record shows and what the courtroom can establish, must be acknowledged honestly, as the gap that it is, rather than elided in either direction. Underscore. Chapter 10. The Eyewitness. What Mohnke said about the bunker. Score. Contemplative, slow. A single instrument, sparse and clear. Underscore. Among the very small number of living first-hand witnesses to the final days in the Führerbunker, Wilhelm Mohnke occupied a position that was historically unique. He had been present not merely as a peripheral observer, a secretary, an adjutant, a clerk, but as a commanding general with direct access to Hitler, present at the military conferences, briefed on the tactical situation in real time, in a position to observe the senior Nazi leadership at the moment of its terminal disintegration. What he saw and heard in those final days in April and early May of 1945 was, from a pure historical standpoint, irreplaceable, and the partial, selective, carefully managed way in which he chose to share that testimony shaped the historiography of the bunker's final chapter in ways that historians are still working to disentangle. His most significant engagement with the historical record came through his conversations with James P. O'Donnell, the American journalist and historian whose book on the bunker, published in 1978 and based on interviews with dozens of surviving members of the bunker circle, drew on multiple sessions with Mohnke. O'Donnell's assessment of Mohnke was complex. He found him to be one of the most substantive and detailed of his sources, a man with a sharp memory for operational specifics, and a willingness to describe the human texture of those final days in ways that many of his contemporaries were less forthcoming about. O'Donnell also noted that Mohnke was careful, not evasive, but precise in a way that reflected extensive prior thought about exactly where the boundaries of his disclosure lay. There were things he would describe in detail. There were things he would acknowledge having witnessed while declining to characterize their significance. And there were things he would simply not discuss at all, redirecting the conversation with the practiced ease of a man who had been interviewed many times and had long since mapped the terrain of what he was and was not willing to say. The specific historical contributions that Mohnke made through these interviews relate primarily to two areas: the internal dynamics of the bunker's command structure in its final weeks, and the circumstances of Hitler's death and its immediate aftermath. On the first subject, Mohnke provided O'Donnell and other historians with detailed operational descriptions of the Citadel defense, the organization of the Kampfgruppe, the communication challenges as Soviet forces pushed closer, the coordination, or lack thereof, between his own SS command and General Weidling's conventional military authority over the broader Berlin defense. These descriptions have been broadly consistent with other sources and have contributed substantially to the detailed tactical picture of the final battle that historians have been able to construct. They are, in the main, reliable in the specific sense that they can be cross-referenced against documentary evidence and other eyewitness accounts, and they hold up. On the second subject, Hitler's death, Mohnke's testimony is more significant, precisely because the circle of people who were physically present in the bunker at the relevant time was so small, and because the Soviets' long-standing uncertainty about whether Hitler had truly died there had created a historiographical problem that the documentary evidence alone could not fully resolve. Mohnke confirmed, consistently across multiple interviews, that Hitler was dead, that he had been informed of Hitler's death by Otto Günscher on the afternoon of the 30th of April, that the information had been treated within the bunker as certain rather than as a report requiring confirmation, and that his subsequent actions in organizing the breakout were predicated on that certainty. His account was consistent with the accounts of other bunker personnel, with the physical evidence that the Soviets had gathered and subsequently suppressed for decades from the Reich Chancellery Garden, and with the forensic conclusions that were eventually confirmed by Soviet archival releases in the 1990s. He was telling the truth about Hitler's death. On that specific question, at least, his eyewitness testimony was both accurate and historically valuable. The Fegelein court-martial, the extraordinary scene that Mohnke described to O'Donnell in what became one of the most cited passages in the bunker historiography, is another example of the kind of first-hand detail that only someone who had been there could provide. The image of Fegelein arriving drunk and incoherent to face a court-martial convened in a bunker under artillery fire, challenging the authority of judges who were themselves operating in conditions of extreme duress, is one of the most vivid illustrations available of the psychological and institutional disintegration of the Nazi leadership's inner circle in those final days. Mohnke described it with a dry, almost clinical precision, the kind of language that a man uses when he is trying to render an experience accurately rather than dramatically, when the experience itself was dramatic enough that no additional narrative weight is required. It is, as an historical source, genuinely valuable, and its value exists entirely independently of any assessment of Mohnke's conduct in other contexts. His descriptions of the other members of the bunker circle, Goebbels, Bormann, Krebs, Bergdorf, the personal staff, are consistent with the portrait that emerges from the broader historiography, while adding specific operational and interactional details that the other sources cannot replicate. He described Goebbels with a respect that was, given the source, somewhat unexpected, acknowledging Goebbels' physical courage in remaining in the bunker when escape was still possible, and his composure in the final hours, while not offering any broader political endorsement of the man or his ideology. He described Bormann, Hitler's secretary, and the effective manager of the Nazi party apparatus, in terms that suggested wariness rather than warmth, the assessment of a military man for a political operator whose methods he did not entirely trust. These are textured, specific human characterizations, not the ideological abstractions of a true believer, and they are part of what makes Mohnke's eyewitness testimony, for all its limitations and deliberate lacunae, a genuinely significant historical resource. He also spoke, in less detail, but with evident personal weight, about the breakout, the night of the 1st of May, the movement through the subway tunnels, the blocked routes, the convergence at the brewery. He described the breakout not as a military operation in any conventional sense, but as an improvised, chaotic, emotionally exhausting movement through a destroyed city by men and women who knew that the probability of success was low, but who had no alternative that involved remaining alive. The distinction between those who chose to continue the attempt and those who chose suicide at various points along the route runs through his account with a quiet, non-judgmental quality that is itself historically significant. The recognition, from a man who had seen a great deal of death in his career, that the choices made in those hours were made by individuals in extremis, and that the logic of each choice made sense to the person who made it, even when the choices themselves led in opposite directions. What Mohnke did not speak about with anything like the same openness was the period before the bunker, the campaigns in France, in Normandy, the specific incidents around which the war crimes allegations clustered. His approach to those subjects was consistent across all the interviews and conversations documented by historians. A denial of personal responsibility, an acknowledgement that terrible things had occurred in the general operational context, and a redirection toward the broader circumstances of the campaigns, rather than the specific incidents. He was not prepared to say nothing. Total silence on those subjects would have attracted its own kind of attention, but what he said was carefully insufficient to constitute either a confession or a definitive exculpation. It was the language of a man who had thought very carefully about the specific informational content of every word he was willing to speak on those subjects, and who had arrived at formulations that disclosed the minimum compatible with appearing cooperative. The historians who worked most closely with him, O'Donnell, Fisher, and others, have generally assessed his testimony as valuable within its limitations and unreliable on the subjects where his personal interest in non-disclosure was most direct. That is perhaps the most honest assessment available. He was an intelligent man with a long memory, a disciplined temperament, and decades of experience in managing what he disclosed and to whom. The historical record that he contributed to is richer for his partial cooperation than it would have been had he maintained total silence, and it is less complete than it would have been had he been willing, at any point, to speak fully about the things he had seen and ordered and been responsible for across the entirety of his career. The gap between those two conditions, between the history he helped to create and the history he chose not to help complete, is itself a historical fact, and it belongs in the record alongside everything else. Underscore. Chapter 11. The Accusers, Survivors Who Would Not Be Silent. Score. Slower now. A quiet, dignified wait. Nothing theatrical. Underscore. History, when it is written only from the perspective of those who hold power, or who survive in positions to control the narrative, is incomplete in a way that matters. The history of Wilhelm Mohnke, as he would have preferred it written, would have been a military biography, the career of a decorated SS general from the early days of the Leibstandarte through the final defense of Berlin, a story of professionalism and loyalty and survival that situated him as a soldier of his time, shaped by the forces around him, no more responsible for the catastrophe than the millions of others who had served in the same machine. There were men who wrote roughly this kind of history about Waffen-SS officers in the post-war decades, unit histories and officer biographies that emphasized tactical competence and military achievement while handling the darker material with careful vagueness. That version of the history had a market, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, and it shaped public understanding of the Waffen-SS in ways that later scholarship has spent considerable effort correcting. The history, as the survivors told it, was different. The men who had been inside the cowshed at Eskelbeck, or who had been outside and survived because they had been placed at the far end, or because a grenade had fallen in a way that spared them, did not tell a military biography. They told a specific, concrete, bodily story about what it felt like to be herded into a barn by armed men, to hear orders being given, to see what happened to the men standing next to them. Their testimony was not abstract, it was not theoretical. It was the testimony of people who had been in a particular place at a particular time and had witnessed particular acts, and who had then spent the rest of their lives carrying the weight of that witness. They were not historians. They were not seeking to produce a balanced assessment of a career. They were survivors, and they were telling the truth as they had experienced it, and the gap between their testimony and the legal record that failed to act on it was not a gap in their honesty, it was a gap in the system. The British soldiers who survived the Wormhout massacre and who gave testimony in the years and decades after the war did so at considerable personal cost, revisiting traumatic experience in formal testimony settings, describing in detail and in response to lawyerly questions what you witnessed at the worst moment of your life, is not a small thing to ask of a person. The survivors who did it, repeatedly, over the course of multiple investigations spanning more than 4 decades, demonstrated a form of persistence and courage that is different in kind from the military decorations that fill the official biographies of the men they were accusing. Their persistence was what kept the Wormhout case alive in the British press and in British political circles, long after the investigating authorities had formally closed it. Their names deserve to be part of this history, even where documentary constraints prevent this account from naming individuals without verified sourcing for each specific person. The veterans' organizations that formed around the memory of the Wormhout killings, associations of survivors from the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and other units that had men in or near the barn at Esquelbeck, maintained a collective memory of the event that official justice failed to satisfy. They wrote letters, they lobbied members of parliament, they gave interviews to journalists, they attended commemorations at the memorial, and they named Mohnke publicly and repeatedly in terms that left no ambiguity about what they believed had happened and who they believed was responsible. The response from Mohnke's direction, when it came at all, was denial, the same consistent, detailed denial that he had maintained across every investigation and every interview. It was a collision of certainties, the certainty of the survivors, rooted in direct experience, and the certainty of the accused, rooted in sustained denial, with the legal system unable to adjudicate definitively between them. The Canadian families and veterans organizations that had been affected by the Normandy killings occupied a parallel position. The trial and imprisonment of Kurt Meyer, who had commanded the 12th SS Panzer Division and who was held responsible for the conduct of his troops in a way that Mohnke was not, provided some measure of formal acknowledgement that the killings had occurred and that SS command responsibility was a legally viable concept. Meyer's conviction was a data point in the ongoing argument about why Mohnke had not been similarly charged. The distinction that investigators drew between the evidentiary record available for Meyer and the evidentiary record available for Mohnke was real in legal terms, but from the perspective of the families of the Canadian soldiers killed under Mohnke's regimental command, it was a distinction that felt arbitrary and inadequate. The soldiers were no less dead. The command responsibility was no less plausible as a historical matter. The legal outcome was simply different, and the reasons it was different were procedural in a way that did not map onto any coherent moral logic. The publication of historical research that directly engaged with the Mohnke allegations, including work by British historian Ian Sayer and journalist Douglas Botting, whose 1982 book on the subject brought the Wormhout case to a broader public audience, represented a form of accountability that operated outside the legal system. Historical judgment, rendered in published books and reviewed in academic journals and discussed in newspaper columns, could not imprison a man. It could not impose a sentence, but it could establish, in the public record, what the historical evidence showed. And what the historical evidence showed, in the case of Mohnke and Wormhout, was sufficiently damaging that the gap between the historical conclusion and the legal non-prosecution became itself a subject of public debate. The book generated considerable media attention in Britain and prompted renewed pressure on the British government to pursue the case through diplomatic channels with the West German authorities. The West German investigation of 1988 was, at least in part, a response to that public pressure. The women of the bunker, the secretaries, the administrative staff, the female personnel who had been present in the Führerbunker during its final days and who had left with Mohnke's breakout group, represented a different kind of witness to a different part of the story. Traudl Junge, whose memoir and subsequent documentary interviews became among the most significant first-hand accounts of Hitler's personal world, did not accuse Mohnke of any crime. She described him as a soldier doing his job in impossible circumstances, a man who organized the breakout professionally, who maintained composure when composure was very hard to maintain, and who managed the practical details of moving a large group of civilians and military personnel through a destroyed city at night with the methodical efficiency that had characterized his command throughout. Her account, like Mohnke's own, occupies a specific position. It is honest and accurate about what it describes, while being necessarily silent about what it could not see. She was not present at Wormhout or in Normandy. She knew Mohnke only from the bunker. Her portrait of him is therefore a portrait of a part of him, the part that was visible from her specific vantage point, and it should be understood as such. The accumulation of survivor testimony, historical research, and sustained advocacy by veterans' organizations across more than 5 decades constitutes a form of historical record that is, in some respects, more complete than what the legal proceedings manage to capture. It is less formally authoritative. Courts and their verdicts carry a weight that even the most rigorously researched history cannot replicate. But it is more honest about the gap between what the evidence shows and what the law could do with the evidence. And it preserves the specific human reality of what happened in that barn in a way that would otherwise have been absorbed into the general, dehumanized statistical record of wartime atrocity. The survivors who refused to be silent about what they had witnessed, who kept naming the name, who kept showing up at the memorial and giving interviews and writing letters and attending hearings, they are part of this history, and they deserve to be named as such. Under. Chapter 12. The Long Afternoon. Growing old with history. Score. Very quiet now. Distant. The sound of a late summer afternoon. Under. There is a particular kind of old age that falls to men who have lived through extreme history and then survived into the long, ordinary afternoon of a changed world. It is not comfortable, exactly. Not because the material circumstances are necessarily difficult, but because the interior experience of that survival involves a continuous, low-level negotiation between memory and the present, between who you were in the years that mattered most and who you are now, between the scale of what you participated in and the smallness of the daily life in which you are ending your days. For some men who served in organizations like the Waffen-SS and survived into old age, that negotiation produced, eventually, something resembling honest reckoning, late-life memoirs, interviews in which the careful defenses of earlier decades were allowed to relax slightly, acknowledgements that were not quite confessions, but that moved in that direction. For Mohnke, the negotiation produced something different. It produced, to the end, the same disciplined, partial, carefully maintained position that he had held since the first investigators came calling in the early post-war years. He did not soften, he did not relent, he did not, in the end, offer the acknowledgement that the survivors had spent their lives waiting for. He gave his final significant interview in the early 1990s, a period when the combination of new archival releases from the former Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, and the renewed public interest in the history of the Third Reich was generating a fresh wave of historical and journalistic attention to men like him. The Soviet archives, opened partially following the end of the Cold War, contained material on the German prisoners held at Lubyanka and at camps like Voikovo, material that had the potential to add to the documentary record of what the Soviets had established about the bunker's final days and about the conduct of the men they had detained. Mohnke was aware of this archival opening. He was also aware that the generation of survivors who had given testimony against him, the men who had been at Wormhout, the veterans of the Normandy fighting, who had watched their comrades die as prisoners, was aging rapidly. He was in his 80s. He had, in the plainest possible terms, outlasted most of the people who most wanted to see him held accountable. The West German and reunified German legal systems had, by the early 1990s, developed a more nuanced approach to the statute of limitations question as it applied to Nazi-era crimes, an approach that had extended the period during which prosecutions could theoretically be brought, and that had, in some landmark cases, established that certain categories of offense carried no statute of limitations at all. But the evidentiary constraints that had blocked the Mohnke prosecution in 1988 had not been resolved by the passage of additional years. They had been made worse. More witnesses had died. More memories had faded. The documentation available remained what it had been, and the political will required to sustain a prosecution of a man who was now in his 80s, who was not publicly active, who had not in any recent period attracted the kind of public controversy that might have created political pressure for action. That will was not consistently present in the institutions that would have been responsible for acting on it. He continued to live in Hamburg. He moved, eventually, into a care facility, the kind of institutional accommodation that old age and its associated physical demands produce for men who reach their 80s and 90s without family proximity or independent capacity. The details of his daily life in those final years are not extensively documented. He was not a public figure in any active sense. He did not give speeches. He did not attend commemorations of former SS formations, or if he did not do so in any way that attracted journalistic documentation. He was, in the most complete possible sense, a private person at the end of his life, surrounded by the routines and limited horizons of institutional care, carrying a biography that was simultaneously one of the most historically significant of his generation and entirely invisible to the nurses and staff who managed his daily needs. The journalists and historians who attempted to speak with him in his final years generally found the same careful, consistent deflection that had characterized his engagements with investigators and researchers across 5 decades. He was not hostile, by most accounts. He was not theatrical in his denials. He was simply done. Done with the subject, or as done as a man could be, who knew that the subject would follow him to the end. He had said what he was prepared to say. He had given what he was prepared to give. The rest was his, and he intended to keep it. For the historians who had spent careers trying to construct the most complete possible account of the events in which he had been a central participant, this final closure was professionally frustrating. For the survivors and their families, it was something considerably more painful than frustration. It was the confirmation of a loss, the loss of a testimony that, had it been freely given, might have provided something that no legal proceeding and no historical reconstruction could substitute for. The account of a responsible person, in his own words, acknowledging what had happened and what his role in it had been. There were moments, in the later interviews and conversations, when something that might have been the edge of that acknowledgement appeared briefly and then withdrew. Historians who spoke with him in the 1990s noted that his denials, while consistent in their content, had acquired a slightly different quality in delivery. Less the sharp, energetic denials of a man actively defending himself, more the tired, rote recitation of positions held so long that they had ceased to feel like active claims and had become simply the established vocabulary of a particular conversation. Whether that fatigue represented something shifting in his interior reckoning with the past, or simply the physical diminishment of extreme old age, cannot be determined from the outside. It is an observation, not a conclusion. What is certain is that the positions did not change. The vocabulary of denial remained the vocabulary of denial to the end. The historical community had, by the final decade of his life, largely stopped waiting for a revelation that was clearly not coming. The scholarly work on the Wormhout massacre, on the Normandy killings, on the Malmedy massacre, and its relationship to the Leibstandarte's command structure, had proceeded without Mohnke's cooperation, and had reached conclusions that were broadly consistent across multiple independent lines of research. The historical consensus on what had happened, not on what could be proven in a court of law, but on what the weight of the available evidence showed, was not dependent on Mohnke's personal testimony, and had not been for some time. He could keep his silence. The history would be written anyway, and it had been. The question of what constitutes a life well lived, or even a life coherently understood, from the inside, is one that any biography of a figure like Mohnke is forced to approach without being able to answer. He survived. He survived the war that killed tens of millions of others. He survived imprisonment. He survived the investigations. He survived long enough to see a reunited Germany build itself into a stable, prosperous democracy, the functional opposite, in most respects, of the regime he had served for the better part of his adult life. What he made of that survival, what moral account he constructed for himself in the privacy of his own interior life, cannot be known. He did not share it. The public record ends at the boundary of his deliberate disclosure, and beyond that boundary is only inference and silence. On the 6th of August, 2001, Wilhelm Mohnke died in Barsbüttel, near Hamburg. He was 90 years old. He was one of the last surviving general officers of the Waffen-SS. He had outlasted the investigations, the investigators, and in some cases the countries, the German Democratic Republic, the Soviet Union, that had been part of the post-war world in which his history was embedded. He left behind no memoir. He left behind a fragmentary, selective, carefully curated partial testimony that historians have been working with and around for decades. He left behind a legal record of non-prosecution that tells you something about the architecture of post-war justice and something about the specific evidentiary difficulties of that architecture, but very little about guilt or innocence in any final moral sense. And he left behind the names and the memories and the graves of the men who had died under his command or under the command of units within his authority. Men whose story continues to be told, and continued to be told while he was still alive, and will continue to be told now that he is gone. The story does not end with Mohnke's death. The questions it raises about command responsibility, about the relationship between legal accountability and historical truth, about what we owe to the witnesses of atrocity and to the people who survived one, are questions that belong to all of us, not only to the courts and the historians and the veterans' organizations that have been carrying them for 8 decades. The bunker is empty. The war ended 70-some years ago. The last defender is gone. But the history remains, fully alive, still demanding the attention it has always deserved. You have now been with us through 12 chapters of the complete history of Wilhelm Mohnke. If this documentary has given you something to think about history, about accountability, about the very long shadow that extreme events cast across ordinary lives, then please share it with someone who would value it. Subscribe to the channel for chapters 13 through 18, where we trace the post-war legal battles in full detail, examine the Wormhout Memorial and its significance, and deliver the final assessment of how history has ultimately judged the last defender of the bunker. The full playlist is in the description. Stay with us. The most complex part of this story is still ahead. Chapter 13. The Wormhout Memorial. What stone remembers? Very still. Wind across open ground. The sound of a bell. Distant single toll. There is a village in the Flemish-speaking borderlands of northern France, not far from where the flat coastal plain runs toward the English Channel, where a stone memorial stands in a field that was once a farm. The village is called Eskelbeck. The farm, or what remains of the memory of it, is the place where a cowshed stood in the late May of 1940. A cowshed in which somewhere between 80 and 100 men, mostly British soldiers of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and some French troops, were herded by armed SS guards and killed with grenades and rifle fire. The memorial was not erected immediately after the war. Memorials to events like this require a particular kind of sustained communal will, the will of survivors who refuse to let what happened simply dissolve into the general, undifferentiated record of wartime violence, and the will of a community to acknowledge that something specific and terrible happened in a specific place. That will, in the case of Wormhout and Esquelbecq, took years to consolidate, but it endured. The British soldiers who survived the barn, and there were survivors, men who escaped through the violence by chance of position or by the particular geometry of how the killing unfolded, came home to a country that was still fighting a war. Their immediate testimony was collected, filed, and placed in investigative records that were maintained across decades of non-prosecution without being closed or discarded. The town of Wormhout itself, which sits roughly 2 kilometers from Esquelbecq, became, over the post-war decades, a place of pilgrimage for the families and comrades of the men who had died there. An annual journey back to the specific geography of a specific atrocity, made by people who understood that the absence of legal resolution made the act of remembrance more necessary, not less. The memorial at Esquelbecq, when it was finally established, was not simply a monument to the dead. It was a statement about the responsibility of the living to maintain a record that the legal system had failed to render into formal judgment. The ceremonies held at the Esquelbecq Memorial in the decades following the war were attended by British veterans, by French officials, by local Belgian and French residents, for whom the events of May 1940 were part of living community memory, and eventually by journalists and historians, whose work on the Wormhout case was bringing the story to broader public attention. The ceremonies were modest, in the way that ceremonies at small local memorials generally are. No enormous state apparatus, no diplomatic grandeur, no official government acknowledgement that matched the scale of what was being commemorated. But their modesty was itself a kind of statement. These were people who came because they chose to come, who remembered because they chose to remember, who insisted on naming what had happened and naming the formation responsible, year after year, in the face of legal closure and official non-response. The persistence of that collective memory across more than half a century is, by any reasonable standard, an extraordinary thing. The publication of Ian Sayer and Douglas Botting's historical research in the early 1980s gave the Wormhout story a new reach. Their work drew on the investigative files, on survivor testimony, on German military records, and on the forensic reconstruction of events that had been built up painstakingly by researchers over the preceding decades. The book named Mohnke directly laid out the evidentiary case against him and argued that the failure to prosecute him represented a significant failure of post-war justice. It was reviewed widely in the British press. It generated parliamentary questions about why the West German authorities had not brought charges. It created a moment of public visibility for the Wormhout case that translated directly into the renewed official investigation of 1988, the West German Review, that, after a multi-year examination, concluded that the evidence remained insufficient for prosecution. The book did not produce the outcome its authors sought, but it produced the investigation, and the investigation produced a formal, documented engagement with the evidence that had not previously existed in that form, and that is itself part of the historical record. The response from Mohnke was consistent with his pattern across all previous inquiries. He denied. He maintained that the killings had not been ordered by him, that the chain of responsibility his accusers had constructed was factually incorrect, that the testimony of survivors was either mistaken or misattributed. His denials, at this point in his life, were delivered with the practiced smoothness of positions held for 4 decades, not the raw energy of a man newly accused, but the settled firmness of a man who has decided exactly what he will and will not say, and has been saying it long enough that the saying itself has become reflexive. He did not sue for defamation. He did not seek a public confrontation with the authors or the historians. He maintained the same posture he had maintained since the first British investigators had come to him in the early post-war years. Patient, consistent, unbending denial, delivered without apparent anxiety, as if the matter had been settled long ago to his own satisfaction, and only continued to be raised by people who had not received or accepted his previous answers. The memorial at Esquelbec continued to be maintained after the 1988 investigation closed the German case. The annual ceremonies continued. The names of the dead continued to be read. The story continued to be told to new generations. School children brought on educational visits, journalists writing anniversary pieces, historians incorporating the case into broader accounts of Waffen-SS conduct during the Western campaigns of 1940. The physical act of maintaining the memorial, keeping the stone clean, the grounds tended, the records updated, is itself a form of historical argument. It argues that these deaths were not absorbed into the general statistical record of wartime loss, that they were specific and identifiable, and the responsibility of specific and identifiable men, and that the passage of time and the closure of legal proceedings did not dissolve that responsibility into something more comfortable and forgettable. When Mohnke died in 2001, the Esquelbec Memorial did not disappear. The ceremonies did not stop. The historical record did not revise itself in the direction of exculpation. The stone remained. The names remained. The investigations remained in the documentary record, along with their inconclusive conclusions and the reasons for those conclusions. What changed on the 6th of August, 2001, was that the last person alive who could have provided a first-person account of what had happened in that barn, who had been in a position to issue an order, to confirm or deny that an order was given, to explain the specific chain of command that led from the military situation on the ground to the killing of prisoners, was gone. Whatever he had kept to himself for 56 years, he kept it still. The memorial remained as the more durable testimony. The broader significance of the Wormhout case, in the context of Waffen-SS battlefield conduct history, is not that it is exceptional. It is that it is representative of a pattern of prisoner killings by Leibstandarte and Hitlerjugend units across multiple campaigns, a pattern sufficiently documented across multiple independent investigations to constitute historical consensus rather than contested allegation. The specific legal outcome of any individual case within that pattern, prosecuted or not, convicted or acquitted, does not change the pattern's existence or its historical meaning. The Wormhout killings sit within a broader history of conduct that the post-war legal and historical process documented, however imperfectly, and that the maintenance of memorials, like the one at Esquelbec, keeps visible in ways that official records alone cannot sustain. Memory, in this context, is not sentiment, it is evidence. It is the form that evidence takes when the legal system has exhausted its capacity to act on it. The village of Wormhout itself, the town that gave its name to the massacre, though the killings actually occurred at the farm in Esquelbec nearby, has carried this history as part of its civic identity for more than 8 decades. The local community's relationship to that history is complex, as it always is when a specific act of extreme violence has occurred in a specific place that must then be lived in, farmed around, driven past, and inhabited by generations who were not present for the event, but who cannot entirely separate themselves from it either. The French and Belgian communities in the Flemish borderlands have, over the decades, incorporated the memory of the events of late May 1940 into a broader regional identity that includes both the violence of occupation and the particular atrocities that accompanied the German advance. The memorial is part of that incorporation, and it will still be there when the last person alive who has any living connection to the events of that day is also gone. The stone remembers, in the end, what the courts could not establish, and what the last witness chose not to say. That is what stone is for. Tengfur. Chapter 14. Malmedy, the shadow that would not lift. Score. Cold. A low, persistent drone. Wind across a winter field. Unscore. Of all the allegations that gathered around the formations under Wilhelm Mohnke's command during his career, the Malmedy massacre of the 17th of December, 1944, cast the longest shadow, not because Mohnke's personal role was the most clearly established of any of the cases, but because Malmedy became, in the post-war American consciousness, the defining atrocity of the Battle of the Bulge, and because the legal proceedings that followed were among the most controversial of all the post-war war crimes trials. The killings at the Balkans crossroads near Malmedy, in which at least 68 American prisoners of war were shot by members of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the battle group that formed the spearhead of the Leibstandarter's advance in the Ardennes offensive, were documented with unusual thoroughness, because American military investigators arrived at the scene relatively quickly, and because the survivors, who had escaped or played dead, gave testimony that was both detailed and consistent. The crime was established beyond reasonable doubt in the historical record from an early stage. What the subsequent legal proceedings generated was not a question about whether the crime had occurred, but a sustained and bitter controversy about the methods used to investigate it and prosecute it. The Malmedy trial, formerly designated as United States versus Valentin Bersin and others, held at Dachau in the summer of 1946, resulted in the conviction of 73 men and the death sentences of 43 of them, including Joachim Peiper, whose battle group had been directly responsible for the killings. Sepp Dietrich, the commander of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, was convicted and sentenced to 25 years. The proceedings were swift by the standards of complex war crimes prosecutions, perhaps too swift, as subsequent reviews would argue. Defense attorneys, in the appeals that followed, raised allegations that the investigative methods used to obtain confessions had been improper, that mock trials, false promises, and physical mistreatment had been used to pressure suspects into confessions that were then used as the evidentiary foundation for convictions. These allegations generated a political and legal controversy that ran for years through the American Congress and the military justice system, and that ultimately resulted in the review and reduction of nearly all the Malmedy sentences, the commutation of all the death sentences to imprisonment, and the eventual release of all the convicted men by the mid-1950s. Mohnke's name appeared in the Malmedy investigation as the divisional commander, the officer in overall command of the formation of which Kampfgruppe Peiper was a part. The question of whether Mohnke had issued orders, prior to the offensive, that conditioned or authorized the killing of prisoners was examined by the American investigators. The specific allegation that a pre-offensive briefing had included instructions about the treatment of prisoners that effectively signaled, if not explicitly ordered, that prisoners were not to be taken, was part of the broader investigative picture. Mohnke denied having issued any such orders. He denied having been present at any briefing at which such instructions were given. The American investigators, for reasons that are not entirely clear from the available documentation, did not pursue prosecution of Mohnke specifically. Their primary focus was on Peiper and the officers and men who had been directly present at the Balkans crossroads. Mohnke remained in Soviet custody for the duration of the Dachau proceedings, which may have been a practical factor in the decision not to pursue him as a primary defendant. When he returned from Soviet captivity in 1955, the Malmedy legal proceedings were formally concluded. The sentences had been reviewed, reduced, and the men convicted had been or were being released. Piper himself was released from Landsberg prison in December of 1956, after serving roughly 10 years. The political controversy that had attended the Malmedy trial, the congressional hearings, the McCarthy-era allegations of Jewish bias against the investigators, the sustained campaign by defense advocates to discredit the prosecution, had produced a public discourse in the United States that was, by the time Mohnke came home, already moving toward a rehabilitation of the Malmedy defendants in some quarters, or at least toward a skepticism about the trial's methods that muddied the historical waters around the factual core of what had happened at the Balkans crossroads. Mohnke, returning to West Germany with the Malmedy convictions already reduced, and the convicted men released, or being released, faced no immediate legal exposure on the Ardennes question. He was aware of the landscape. He navigated it accordingly. The scholarly re-examination of the Malmedy case, in subsequent decades, has consistently affirmed the historical reality of the killings, while maintaining a more nuanced view of the specific command responsibility question. The killings occurred. The Leibstandartes soldiers carried them out. The question of whether specific orders were issued or whether the conduct reflected a broader organizational culture of disregard for prisoner rights, a culture fostered by the SS's ideological formation and by the specific combat conditions of the Ardennes offensive, is one that historians have engaged with in depth, without reaching a single, universally agreed conclusion on the specific question of pre-offensive orders. What the historical consensus does support is that the Leibstandarte, under Mohnke's divisional command, committed the killings, and that the organizational context in which those killings occurred was one that Mohnke was responsible for shaping and maintaining. Command responsibility, in the historical, rather than the strictly legal sense, does not require a specific verbal order. It encompasses the culture of command, the standards enforced or not enforced, the precedents set or tolerated by the commander's conduct across the entire period of his command. The Malmedy case also illustrates, with particular clarity, the way in which the legal controversies of the post-war trials could be used, deliberately or inadvertently, to obscure the historical record of the crimes themselves. The procedural irregularities of the Dachau proceedings were real and serious, and the review process that addressed them was appropriate in legal terms. But the political noise generated by the controversy over investigative methods had the effect, in public discourse, of casting doubt not just on the trial's procedures, but on the underlying facts. A displacement of attention from what had happened at the Balkans crossroads to how the investigation had been conducted. For the survivors of the massacre, and for the families of those who had died there, on that December afternoon in 1944, the displacement was another form of loss, the loss of a clear, undisturbed historical record that could not be confused with the procedural imperfections of the prosecution. Mohnke's relationship to the Malmedy history followed the same pattern as his relationship to Wormhout and Normandy: consistent denial, engagement on his own terms, and the maintenance of a position carefully calibrated to neither confess nor provide the specific detail that might expose him to fresh legal action. He acknowledged, in interviews, that the killings had occurred. He denied personal responsibility for them in any direct sense. He positioned himself as a divisional commander who had been managing a large-scale offensive operation and who could not be held responsible for every action taken by every unit within his command under conditions of intense combat. The argument was not without some force as an abstract proposition. Divisional commanders in fluid offensive operations do not exercise minute-by-minute oversight of every unit's conduct. But the specific context of the Malmedy killings, a formal prisoner of war situation in which the men killed had already surrendered and been taken into custody, was precisely the context in which command responsibility standards applied most clearly and most directly. A prisoner who has surrendered is not a combatant. The obligation to protect him is not conditional on the pace of the operational tempo. The shadow of Malmedy over Mohnke's biography is, in some respects, the most historically significant of the shadows that followed him, simply because Malmedy was the most extensively documented and the most widely known of the incidents associated with his command. When his name appears in the popular historical literature about the Battle of the Bulge, it is almost always in the context of Malmedy. As the divisional commander, the officer above Piper in the chain of command, the man who sits at the top of the organizational chart that ends at the Balkans crossroads. That positional fact is not disputed. It is simply there, embedded in the historical record, connecting his name to the event, as surely as the documentation connects Piper's name to the crossroads. What is disputed, and what the legal record could never establish, is the precise nature and extent of his responsibility for what happened there. The history lives in that gap, in the space between the positional fact and the unresolvable question. Piper himself, released from prison in the 1950s, lived in West Germany for some years before moving to France, where he was killed in an attack on his home in July of 1976, an act attributed to political extremists, though no one was ever convicted of the killing. His death at the age of 61 was, for many of those who had served under his command and with whom he had maintained contact in the post-war decades, a deeply unsettling event, a reminder that the past was not simply past, that the judgments it produced were not merely legal or historical, but personal, in ways that time alone could not fully neutralize. Mohnke outlived Piper by 25 years, dying in comfortable obscurity in 2001, at 90. The difference in their fates is itself a kind of historical data point, about survival, about luck, about the unpredictable ways in which historical accountability eventually settles, or fails to settle, on the individuals who made history. Undercore. Chapter 15. The Historian's Reckoning. Building the Record Without Him. Score. Studious. A quiet, methodical rhythm. A library's ambient stillness. Undercore. History, in the end, does not wait for permission. The men and women who devoted significant portions of their professional lives to constructing the most accurate and complete possible account of Wilhelm Mohnke's career, his role in the Wormhout killings, in the Normandy prisoner deaths, in the Malmedy chain of command, in the final defense of Berlin, did their work largely without his cooperation, against his resistance, and in the absence of a legal process that might have compelled disclosure. They worked in archives in Germany, Britain, the United States, Canada, and Belgium. They gathered survivor testimony over multiple decades. They cross-referenced unit histories against operational maps, against signals intercepts, against the fragmentary documentary record that survived the war's physical and deliberate destruction of German military paperwork. They built, piece by piece, a picture that was more complete than any single source could have provided, and they placed that picture in the public record in forms that could be examined, critiqued, revised, and extended by subsequent researchers. The historiography of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler is, by the standards of Waffen-SS unit history, unusually extensive. The unit's combination of political significance, as Hitler's personal guard, and operational history, fighting in every major campaign of the European war, made it a subject of sustained scholarly and journalistic interest from the earliest post-war years. The initial wave of histories, produced largely in the 1950s and 60s by former members of the unit, and by German military historians working within a tradition that emphasized operational analysis over moral accounting, provided a foundation of factual information about the unit's campaigns that subsequent scholarship could use while interrogating the evaluative frameworks within which that information had originally been presented. The later scholarship, from the 1970s onward, as a new generation of historians brought different methodological commitments and less personal proximity to the events, systematically revisited the earlier accounts and subjected them to a more rigorous engagement with the evidence for war crimes and atrocities. The specific work on Wormhout by Sayer and Botting was not the only historical contribution to the Mohnke record, but it was among the most publicly influential. Their 1982 account drew on British investigative files that had not previously been widely available, on testimony from survivors gathered in the years before most of them had died, and on the documentary reconstruction of the chain of command that placed Mohnke at the relevant position at the relevant time. Their research was disputed in some of its specific conclusions by other historians, which is entirely normal in historical scholarship. The process of critique and revision is how the field corrects itself and reaches more reliable conclusions over time. What was not successfully disputed was the core evidentiary picture that soldiers of Mohnke's battalion had committed the killings, that the command structure placed him in authority at the relevant moment, and that the documentary and testimonial record made him the most plausible responsible officer. The dispute was about the strength and completeness of the evidentiary chain, not about its basic direction. Canadian military history made its own contribution to the record through the sustained documentation of the Normandy prisoner killings. The Canadian War Crimes Investigation Unit, established in the immediate post-war period under Lieutenant Colonel Bruce MacDonald, had been one of the most thorough of all the Allied investigative units in terms of the scope and rigor of its work. MacDonald's team had interviewed survivors, gathered physical evidence, reconstructed the sequence of events at multiple sites, and built case files on individual officers that remain among the most detailed sources available for the Normandy atrocity history. The case file on Mohnke sat alongside the case file on Kurt Meyer and other Hitler-Jugend officers. It documented the same pattern of conduct, drew the same command responsibility inferences, and reached the same basic conclusion about individual responsibility. The difference in legal outcome between Meyer and Mohnke was not a reflection of the Canadian investigators' assessment of the evidence. It was a reflection of the specific prosecutorial and jurisdictional decisions made in the immediate post-war period about which cases to bring first, with what resources, and in what sequence. American military historians working on the Battle of the Bulge produced, over the decades, a body of scholarship on the Malmedy massacre that was particularly extensive, partly because the legal proceedings at Dachau had generated an unusual volume of documentary material that remained available to researchers, and partly because the massacre had achieved a particular significance in American military and cultural memory of the war that sustained interest in understanding it as completely as possible. The work of historians examining the Malmedy case in its full command context, tracing the chain of command from the men at the Bargwins Crossroads, back up through Piper's battle group, to the Leibstandarte Divisional Command and beyond, placed Mohnke's positional responsibility squarely in the record. No serious historical account of Malmedy, written after roughly the 1980s, omits his name or his command position. The historical record, on this point, is not in dispute. The question that historians of this material have returned to repeatedly is a structural one, not specific to Mohnke. How does the historical discipline handle the gap between what the evidence shows and what the legal process could establish? The answer, in practice, has been to develop a language of historical responsibility that is distinct from the language of legal culpability. A language that can say, the evidence shows that this person was in a position of command responsibility for these events, and that the weight of the available evidence suggests personal responsibility for specific conduct, without claiming either the certainty of a criminal conviction or the finality of a judicial acquittal. This language is more honest about the nature of historical knowledge, which is always probabilistic and always subject to revision in the light of new evidence, than the binary language of legal verdict allows. It also, in the specific context of the Mohnke case and cases like it, provides a form of public historical judgment that serves some of the functions that legal accountability serves, while being honest about its own limitations. The archival releases from the former Soviet Union that began in the late 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s added a further dimension to the historical record. The Soviets had maintained extensive documentation on the German prisoners held at Lubyanka and subsequent camps, documentation that included interrogation records, medical records, correspondence, and the administrative paperwork of the Soviet detention system. Not all of this material has been released or fully processed, and the portions relating to senior German SS officers remain only partially accessible. But what has emerged has allowed historians to fill in aspects of Mohnke's captivity that had previously been known only from his own selective account, confirming the broad outlines while adding detail about the specific subjects of interrogation and the duration and conditions of solitary confinement that Mohnke's own account had not fully provided. The work of oral history, the systematic collection of first-hand testimony from people who had direct experience of the events under examination, made its own essential contribution, precisely because the documentary record was so fragmentary. The survivor testimonies, gathered by historians working on the Wormhout case, on the Normandy killings, and on the Battle of Berlin, represent a form of evidence that no archival document can replicate: the specific, embodied, emotionally present account of a person who was there, who experienced what they experienced, and who has carried that experience for a lifetime. Oral history has its methodological limitations. Memory changes over time. The framing of questions shapes the answers given. The passage of decades between the event and the recording of testimony introduces the possibility of conflation and omission. But within those limitations, the testimony gathered from survivors of the events in which Mohnke was involved represents irreplaceable historical evidence that the formal documentary record alone cannot provide. By the time Mohnke died in 2001, the historical record on his career was as complete as it was likely to become in the absence of additional archival releases. It was not complete in the sense of having resolved every specific question to the satisfaction of every researcher. It was complete in the sense that the broad shape of what had happened, what had been commanded, what had been done, what the available evidence showed about responsibility, was documented across multiple independent lines of research and accessible to any person willing to engage with it honestly. The history had been written. It had been written without him, against his resistance, in the face of sustained denial, and it stood. That is what scholarship is, in the end, the organized, collective effort to reconstruct the truth about events that specific individuals would sometimes prefer remain unexamined. It succeeded as well as it could. Underscore, underscore, underscore. Chapter 16. Command, Conscience, and the Ordinary Man. Score, reflective, slow, a quiet counterpoint between two instruments. Among the most significant intellectual challenges that the history of the Second World War poses to those who study it seriously is the question of how ordinary people, people formed by recognizable human processes of upbringing, ambition, social pressure, and institutional belonging, came to participate in, command, or enable acts of extraordinary cruelty. The philosophical and psychological literature on this question is extensive, running from Hannah Arendt's landmark analysis of the Eichmann trial through the social psychology experiments of Stanley Milgram, through the more recent historical scholarship of Christopher Browning, Daniel Goldhagen, and many others. Each of these frameworks offers something useful and something limited. Together, they constitute an ongoing attempt to understand a phenomenon that resists any single, complete explanation. The transformation of ordinary human beings into participants in mass atrocity, and the specific mechanisms by which that transformation occurs. Mohnke's biography sits within this literature in a particular way. He was not, in the obvious sense, an ideological fanatic of the type that the popular imagination most readily associates with the worst of the Third Reich's violence. He was not a Himmler or an Heydrich, a man whose primary motivation was the systematic implementation of a racial ideology. He was, in his own self-presentation and in the assessment of those who knew him in his post-war years, primarily a soldier, a man whose identity was organized around military professionalism, unit loyalty, and the hierarchical structure of the Waffen-SS, in which he had spent his entire adult working life. He joined the party and the SS in 1931, when he was 20 years old, and the party was not yet in power. In a Germany of social and economic instability, where the organizations of the radical right were offering young men without clear career prospects a framework of identity and belonging that was powerful precisely because it was unconditional. He rose through that framework by performing well on the measures it valued: physical courage, organizational competence, loyalty to his superiors, and by forming the personal relationships that carried him from one level of command to the next. The framework also killed people. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler was not a neutral professional organization that happened to have political associations. Its formation was explicitly tied to Hitler's personal political project. Its oath was to Hitler personally. Its institutional culture was shaped by the ideology of the regime that created it, and its conduct in the field, across multiple campaigns on multiple fronts, included the killing of prisoners of war and civilian populations in ways that went beyond anything that could be explained by the heat of combat or the fog of war. These are not additions to the history of the unit. They are part of the unit's history, inseparable from its tactical record and its organizational genealogy. A man who commanded that unit's formations at the level of company, battalion, regiment, and division across the entire span of the war was not, by the end of it, simply a professional soldier who had the misfortune to serve in an organization with a troubling history. He was a participant in that history, shaped by it and responsible to it, in ways that his own carefully maintained post-war narrative consistently underweighted. The ordinary man argument, the contention that the perpetrators of atrocity under the Third Reich were not monsters, but ordinary people responding to extraordinary institutional pressure, is important precisely because it locates moral responsibility in a place that is more uncomfortable than monsterism, in the specific choices made, repeatedly, over years, to follow orders that a person of ordinary moral conscience should have recognized as wrong. Mohnke made those choices. He made them in Poland, in France, in the Balkans, on the Eastern Front, in Normandy, in the Ardennes, and in Berlin. He made them as a junior officer and as a senior general. He made them within a system that rewarded compliance and punished resistance. But that system's rewards and punishments were not sufficient, on their own, to explain the choices fully. People within that system did, occasionally, refuse orders. People did object. The consequences of objection were variable and not uniformly catastrophic. The choice to comply was still a choice, made by a specific person with a specific history of choices behind them. What the ordinary man framework cannot do, and what no framework can do, is resolve the moral question into a clean conclusion. Understanding how ordinary people come to participate in atrocity does not excuse the participation. It contextualizes it, which is a different and more demanding intellectual task. Contextualization requires holding multiple things simultaneously: the The recognition that Mohnke was shaped by forces that were real and powerful, that he was not a unique psychological specimen, but a representative of a broad class of men formed by the same historical pressures, and the recognition that his choices were still his choices, that the victims of those choices were still victims, and that the fact of contextual explanation does not dissolve personal responsibility. These things do not cancel each other, they coexist, and the intellectual honesty required to hold them in coexistence, without resolving the tension into a simpler story in either direction, is one of the most important things that serious engagement with the Second World War's human history demands of us. The specific case of command responsibility, the question of how far up the chain of command accountability extends for atrocities committed by subordinate units, is one that the post-war legal and historical process addressed imperfectly but persistently. The Nuremberg Principles established, clearly and formally, that command responsibility was real, that superior orders did not excuse subordinate conduct, and that commanders were responsible for crimes committed by troops under their command that they knew about or should have known about. The subsequent application of those principles in specific prosecutions was inconsistent, shaped by the practical limitations of investigation and by political considerations that did not always align neatly with the principled commitment to accountability. Mohnke's non-prosecution was, in part, a consequence of those inconsistencies, not a principled finding of his innocence, but the outcome of a set of practical and evidentiary constraints that the available institutional mechanisms could not overcome. The question of what Mohnke's conscience, if such a thing can be inferred from the outside, contained across the 56 years between his capture in Berlin and his death in 2001, is one that this documentary cannot answer. It can only observe what is observable, that he maintained consistent denial without apparent psychological cost, that he engaged selectively with the historical record in ways that served his narrative interests, that he did not, as some others in comparable situations eventually did, move in the direction of acknowledgement, apology, or any form of reckoning with his personal responsibility for what had happened under his command. Whether this reflected a genuine interior conviction that he was not responsible, or a decision that denial was the safest available strategy, or something more psychologically complex than either of those possibilities captures, that remains, as so much in his biography remains, opaque. The moral landscape of the Second World War, the landscape in which men like Mohnke made the choices they made, in the institutional contexts that shaped and rewarded those choices, was not a landscape of unique or incomprehensible evil. It was a landscape of ordinary human beings, in extraordinary circumstances, making choices whose consequences they did not always fully anticipate and could not always fully control, within systems designed to channel and amplify the worst of those choices. Understanding that landscape is not the same as accepting it, or forgiving it, or domesticating it into something that no longer disturbs us. It is the beginning of the kind of understanding that makes the recurrence of such landscapes less likely. That is why the history matters, not to rehabilitate anyone, and not to condemn anyone beyond the evidence, but to be honest, as rigorously and as honestly as possible, about what happened, who did it, and what we owe to the people it happened to. Underscore. Chapter 17. Berlin after the fire. The city that survived. Score. Gradually warmer. Still slow. The sound of reconstruction in the distance. Penon. Berlin, in the decades after the war, was many things simultaneously. A divided city, a Cold War symbol, a laboratory for competing visions of how a German society might reconstitute itself after total collapse, and a physical landscape of ruin and reconstruction that made the recent past impossible to ignore, even when its inhabitants most wanted to. The Führer bunker itself, the concrete structure beneath the Reich Chancellery, in which Mohnke had held his last command, and from which he had organized the breakout on the night of the 1st of May 1945, occupied an increasingly complex position in Berlin's post-war geography. It sat, for most of the Cold War period, in the eastern sector of the divided city, on territory controlled by the German Democratic Republic, whose official historiography of the Second World War had its own political requirements and its own selective emphases that shaped what could be done with the physical remnants of the Nazi state. The GDR's approach to the physical remains of the Third Reich in East Berlin was shaped by a fundamental political premise: that the German Democratic Republic was the legitimate heir to the anti-fascist resistance, and that the crimes of the Nazi state were therefore the crimes of capitalism, imperialism, and the Western bourgeois tradition, rather than of the German people as such. This framing had practical consequences for what was preserved, what was demolished, and what was commemorated in East Berlin. The Reich Chancellery was demolished by Soviet engineers shortly after the war. The bunker itself was partially demolished. The upper section, the so-called Vorbunker, was more thoroughly destroyed. The lower Führerbunker, with its reinforced concrete construction, proved more resistant to demolition and survived in a partially sealed state beneath the ground of what would become, in the divided city, a stretch of no man's land near the Berlin Wall. West Berlin, and then the reunified Berlin that emerged after the wall came down in November of 1989, faced different but equally complex questions about what to do with the physical and symbolic heritage of the Nazi period. The reunification of the city produced an intensive public debate about commemoration, about how to mark the sites of atrocity and of Nazi power in ways that were honest and respectful of historical truth, without creating monuments that could be appropriated by the political movements that the commemoration was designed to oppose. The Führerbunker site was, in this context, one of the most sensitive in the city. The question of whether to mark it and how engaged historians, politicians, urban planners, and the broader public in a debate that reflected the genuine difficulty of the underlying moral and practical problem. The eventual decision to place a modest informational sign near the site, acknowledging its historical significance without creating any structure that might become a place of pilgrimage for those who wished to venerate rather than understand, reflected the pragmatic compromise that the German approach to physical commemoration of the Nazi period has generally favored. The bunker's precise location is not heavily publicized. There is no significant physical marker at the site. It sits, for most of its current neighbors, as an unremarkable piece of urban landscape, a parking area, a playground, ordinary city life flowing across the ground above a concrete structure that once contained one of the most consequential rooms in 20th century history. That ordinariness is itself a choice, and a considered one. The deliberate refusal of monumentality is a form of historical argument, an argument against the elevation of this place into something whose physical presence might overwhelm the moral and historical understanding that the place requires. The broader project of Berlin's physical and psychological reconstruction in the 50 years following the war is inseparable from the story of how Germany came to understand and account for the Nazi period, which is itself inseparable from the stories of the men who had been at the center of that period and who survived into the post-war decades. Mohnke's presence in Hamburg, not in Berlin, but in the same country, the same society, the same cultural and political community that was working through this process, was a physical fact that the process had to accommodate. He was there, he was known to be there, and the society around him made a series of choices, through its legal institutions and its political culture, about what to do with his continued presence. Those choices, the choices that resulted in non-prosecution, in a limited public acknowledgement, in the tacit social accommodation of a man against whom serious historical allegations existed, were not unanimous or unconsidered. They were the product of the same tensions and ambiguities that shaped every aspect of Germany's post-war engagement with its recent history. The memorial culture of the reunified Germany, the network of museums, memorials, documentary centers, and educational institutions that Germany has built to confront the Nazi period, is, by the standards of most countries that have experienced comparable catastrophes, unusually extensive and unusually honest. The Holocaust Memorial in the heart of Berlin, the documentation centers at former concentration camp sites, the extensive network of local and regional memorial institutions, the mandatory history curriculum in German schools. These represent a sustained national commitment to remembrance and accountability that has few parallels in the world. They did not prevent Mohnke from living out his final decades in comfortable non-prosecution, but they do represent the broader context in which his story exists, a context that insists, through institutional architecture and public commemoration, that forgetting is not an option, whatever the specific outcomes of individual legal proceedings may have been. The people of Berlin, the current inhabitants of the city that Mohnke defended in the spring of 1945, did not, for the most part, know his name. He was not a famous figure in the way that some of the Third Reich's senior leadership were famous, by virtue of the Nuremberg proceedings or the post-war histories. He was a general, one of several dozen senior Waffen-SS officers, whose names appeared in the specialist literature and in the investigative files, but not in the popular consciousness of a public whose engagement with the Nazi period was shaped primarily by the crimes of the Holocaust and the political biography of the top leadership. His was a kind of middle-distance obscurity, known to those who studied the period closely, unknown or barely known to those who engaged with it more casually. That obscurity was, in its way, the most effective protection he could have had. The Berlin that emerged from the Cold War and from the reunification process of the early 1990s was a city actively engaged in the physical reconstruction of its own identity, tearing down the wall, filling in the death strip, rebuilding the areas of the city that had been split and stunted by 4 decades of division. That reconstruction was also a moral and historical project, an ongoing negotiation between the need to build something new and the obligation to remain honest about what had been built and destroyed before. The Führerbunker sat beneath all of it, sealed and mostly silent, a physical fact that the city had decided to neither demolish completely nor commemorate visibly, but simply to carry, underground, unmarked, present without being prominent, as part of the weight that the history of this particular place requires its present inhabitants to carry, whether they know it or not. The last defender of the bunker lived 350 kilometers to the northwest, in a care facility near Hamburg, and died in the summer of 2001. Berlin, which had burned around him in the spring of 1945, was by then a reunited, living, rebuilding city of millions, perhaps the most striking physical rebuke to the project he had served available in the contemporary world. Cities, it turns out, are harder to kill than the men who tried to kill them. History, too, is harder to kill than the men who tried to shape it in their own interests. Both survive. Underscore Chapter 18. The Final Verdict. What History Decides. Score. Very quiet. Unhurried. The simplest possible melody. History does not issue verdicts in the way that courts do. It does not produce, at the end of a proceeding, a document with a clear finding and a definitive consequence. What it produces is something more durable and more complex, a record, built across time by many different people, working from many different positions, and with many different forms of evidence, that accumulates toward a picture of what happened and what it meant. That picture is never final. It is always subject to revision in the light of new evidence or new frameworks of understanding, but at any given moment, it represents the best available account of the past, and it carries a weight that is different in kind from the weight of a legal verdict, but not necessarily smaller. The historical verdict on Wilhelm Mohnke is not kind, it is not vindictive, and it is not, in the work of the serious historians who have engaged with his career most carefully, distorted by the animus that sometimes shapes popular accounts of figures associated with the worst of the Nazi period. It is simply honest, and the honest historical assessment is that Mohnke commanded formations that committed atrocities against prisoners of war on multiple occasions across multiple campaigns, that his position in the chain of command at the time of those atrocities places a substantial burden of command responsibility on him, that his consistent personal denials did not and could not neutralize, and that the legal non-prosecution that allowed him to live out his life without formal accountability was the product of specific evidentiary and institutional limitations, rather than of a considered finding of his innocence. The specific incidents around which the historical record clusters, Wormhout in May of 1940, the Normandy prisoner killings in June of 1944, the Malmedy chain of command in December of 1944, are not isolated data points. They are part of a pattern that runs through the operational history of the formations he commanded. The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend were not units that incidentally committed war crimes during otherwise conventional military operations. They were units whose conduct across multiple campaigns reflected an institutional culture shaped by ideology and by command example, in which the protections afforded to prisoners of war and to civilians were treated as conditional and negotiable in ways that violated the most fundamental standards of the laws of war. Command responsibility in that context is not simply about specific orders. It is about the culture a commander creates, maintains, and tolerates within his formation. Mohnke's career in command of these formations spans their entire operational history. His responsibility for the culture is inseparable from his responsibility for the conduct that culture produced. The historical verdict also encompasses the specific historical contributions that Mohnke made, the eyewitness testimony about the bunker's final days, the operational descriptions of the Citadel defense, the first-hand account of Hitler's death and its aftermath, and acknowledges them as genuine and valuable additions to the historical record. A person can be both a primary historical source of significant value and a person against whom the historical record raises serious questions of responsibility. Those two things are not in tension. They are simply both true, simultaneously, and the intellectual honesty of a serious historical account requires holding them together rather than resolving them into a simpler, cleaner judgment in either direction. The broader historical significance of the Mohnke case, beyond the specific facts of his career, lies in what it illustrates about the architecture of accountability and its limitations. Every investigation that examined the allegations against him and concluded that prosecution was not possible for evidentiary reasons was operating within a system of justice that is, in principle, designed to protect the innocent from conviction on insufficient evidence. That protection is real and important, but the same protection that prevents the conviction of the wrongly accused. Also, in cases where the evidence is genuinely insufficient for legal purposes, but historically sufficient for historical purposes, prevents the formal acknowledgement of responsibility that victims and survivors deserve. The gap between those two outcomes, legal non-prosecution and historical responsibility, is not a flaw in the system, exactly. It is a feature. It is the price paid for the protection of the innocent. But it is a price that is paid, in specific cases, by the people who survived the crimes and who waited their whole lives for a formal accountability that never came. The survivors of the Wormhout Barn, the families of the Canadian soldiers killed in Normandy, the families of the American soldiers who died at Malmedy, they are the people on behalf of whom history is ultimately written. In the cases like this one, they did not receive the legal verdict that they sought. They received, instead, a historical record, built slowly, imperfectly, against resistance, by scholars and journalists and investigators and commemorative communities who refused to let the events dissolve into the general statistical fog of wartime violence. That historical record is their inheritance from the people who worked to construct it. And it is the inheritance that this documentary is adding to, in its own way, by placing the complete story of Wilhelm Mohnke's life in a form that can be understood, discussed, and carried forward by anyone who takes the time to engage with it honestly. He was born in Lübeck on the 15th of March 1911. He died in Barschbüttel on the 6th of August 2001. Between those two dates, he served in the most powerful and most destructive military organization in the history of the Third Reich, from its founding to its collapse. He fought in Poland, France, the Balkans, the Soviet Union, Normandy, the Ardennes, and Berlin. He was wounded multiple times and decorated repeatedly. He commanded men in circumstances that brought out both their highest professional capacities and their worst institutional impulses. He survived Soviet captivity for a decade. He rebuilt a civilian life in West Germany. He outlasted every investigation. He maintained, to the end, a silence about the things that mattered most to the people who had been hurt by them. And he was, by the measure of any serious historical account, responsible, not uniquely, not in ways that isolated him from the broader institutional and ideological context that shaped and enabled his conduct, but genuinely and specifically responsible for things that happened under his command and that his command culture made more likely. That responsibility is not dissolved by the absence of a legal verdict. It is not dissolved by the passage of time. It is not dissolved by the fact that he was, in some respects, a capable officer, or a faithful subordinate, or a methodical and professional commander in situations that required methodical and professional management. It coexists with all of those things, as moral responsibility always coexists with the complexity of a full human life, neither consuming that life entirely, nor disappearing from it. It is part of the record. It belongs in the record. And the record belongs to all of us, to the people who study this period professionally, and to the people who encountered this history for the first time tonight, in whatever quiet hour of a sleepless night brought them here. The Führer bunker is silent now. The streets above it are ordinary and full of life. The war ended more than 80 years ago. The last defender of the bunker has been in the ground for more than 20 years. But the history remains alive. Alive in the archives, in the memorials, in the testimonies that were gathered before the witnesses died, in the scholarly work that built the record piece by piece, and in the stories that communities of survivors and their descendants continue to tell to anyone willing to listen. That aliveness is not nostalgia. It is not sentimentality. It is the refusal of the past to be simply past when its consequences are still present, in the families of those who died, in the communities that still maintain their memorials, in the questions that this story continues to raise about command, conscience, and the things that ordinary people are capable of doing in extraordinary times. The history of Wilhelm Mohnke is not a comfortable history. It was never meant to be. It is honest history, and honest history, told carefully and without flinching, is the only kind worth staying awake for. This has been the complete 18-chapter documentary history of Wilhelm Mohnke, last defender of the bunker. If you have stayed with us from the opening hook through this final chapter, You have just completed one of the most detailed historical documentaries available on this subject. We are genuinely grateful for your time and your attention. If this series gave you something, a deeper understanding of this period, a new perspective, a question worth carrying forward, please share it with someone who would value it. Subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below with the moment in the series that stayed with you most. We read every one. And look out for our next long-form documentary series, linked in the description and the end screen. History is long. We will be here for all of it. Thank you for watching.